Welcome to Pratidwani, where we try to humanize science. I'm your host, GV Pawan Kumar. Pratidwani is a non-commercial free podcast. You can access it on various platforms, including my lab's YouTube channel, which is named as GV Pawan Kumar Lab. It is also available on Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, and other related platforms. I run this podcast in my personal capacity, so please subscribe and share to this particular platform. Specifically on the YouTube channel, you will get a lot of information, including this audio podcast and many videos related to our research and various interesting aspects of history of science. And now to the interesting part. It is my pleasure to introduce you to my guest, Amitabh Joshi. Amitabh is India's one of the foremost evolutionary biologist and population ecologist. He is also a poet in Urdu and English and occasionally also in Persian. He is a professor in evolutionary and organismal biology unit at Jawaharlal Nehru Center for Advanced Scientific Research, Bengaluru. And as per his webpage, he does not view science as a career, but as a way a classical musician would view music. He is also the founding member and member of Executive Council of Indian Society of Evolutionary Biologists. In addition to science, Amitabh is seriously interested in poetry, and that will actually come across very well in this podcast. He's also very interested in philosophy, history, and military science. His Twitter profile very nicely puts it across the way Amitabh thinks. He mentions that coffee is the essence of life, poetry trumps science. I know Amitabh since my PhD days at JNCSR, and it has always been a pleasure to interact with him over the years. And I'm sure you would also find it very delightful to listen to him. So in this long format podcast, mind you, this is 3-hour episode. We had an elaborate discussion on him becoming a biologist, his journey into the realm of genetics and evolutionary biology, science and its interface with society, which is an important topic nowadays, and how to do research itself. This is something Amitabh meditates and gives us some very interesting insights, and how to think through problems in the context of research. We also discuss a very important aspect, which is sometimes not kind of considered in great detail, which is the interface of art and science. In a way, we broke the myth of C.P. Snow's essay on two cultures, so to speak, and it was a very enjoyable discussion. Also, don't miss the fabulous recitation of poems in Persian and Urdu, including lines from Iqbal and Rumi, which I am very sure you'll all enjoy, and also some delightful insights on his thought process in his own mother tongue, which is very insightful also. There's so much to listen, learn, and think when you listen to Amitabh, and I'm sure all of you would be benefited out of this particular interaction. So do also check the show notes. You will get a lot of relevant information, and you can go deeper into a lot of things what we have discussed as part of this particular episode. Generally, when I prepare introduction of my guests, I associate their expertise with the title of the episode. But with Amitabh, it is impossible to box him only as a scientist or as a poet. So what I did was, I went meta, which means that I am calling this episode Conversation with Amitabh Joshi, the Beautiful Mind. This is the only way I could do justice to what Amitabh is and what Amitabh does. He adds poetry and beauty to science, and only a beautiful mind like Amitabh can do this. This is Pratidwani, where we try to humanize science. I'm delighted to have Professor Amitabh Joshi. I'm going to actually call him Amitabh on this particular interaction, because I have had a wonderful experience having kind of talked not only about science and various different things. So first and foremost, Amitabh, welcome to Pratidwani, and I'm delighted to have you as my guest today.
It's great to be on.
Yeah, thank you, Amitabh. So, Amitabh, first and the most important thing is, how did Amitabh Joshi, the scientist, become a scientist. Could you please let us know the background of what it took for you to become what you are now, both a very reputed evolutionary biologist and also a deep thinker? That is something I and my audience would be very interested to know about.
Well, it's actually it was a slightly convoluted path, as paths often are,
Mm-hmm.
and I have never really been somebody who planned things in life too much. Uh, my usual metaphor of life is you float downstream and enjoy whatever views life shows you instead of
Yeah.
trying to swim upstream, which is another common metaphor for life. So actually, I grew up in a fairly academic household. My father was a university professor and a
Mm-hmm.
very serious academician. He was trained as a mathematician, worked in statistics, but had very, very broad intellectual interests in literature, history, art, music, philosophy, you name it. And so there were lots of books at home. I was a very voracious reader, mostly of storybooks when I was a kid,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then gradually started reading slightly more serious things. And I was the younger of two brothers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I was always, in some sense, reading a few years ahead of my age because I was reading all the books that my elder brother was reading.
Elder brothers.
Uh,
Nice.
so I sort of read many books 3 4 years ahead of my age compared to my classmates or others. But initially, till I was about 16, my major desire was to join the army.
Wow.
And
Okay.
when I was a teenager, I had started reading a lot of military science and military history, and
Yeah.
many of my relatives were in the army. So we had all
Yes.
these very exciting uncles, who had fought in World War II, who fought in the 1965 war, in the 71 war, and so on. And they had amazing stories to tell, and it was just terribly fascinating.
Wonderful.
And at some point when I was about 16, one day it suddenly hit me like a revelation that given that I didn't like taking orders from anybody, including my class teachers,
Mm-hmm.
I would probably be shot for insubordination if I joined the army. And I suddenly, realized, this is not for me.
Amazing.
And after that, I wanted to be in academics. I
Yeah.
couldn't think of anything else, but it was not clear in which discipline at all. When
Yeah.
I was in school, I enjoyed all subjects a lot except Hindi,
Mm-hmm.
although it was,
Surprise.
in some sense, my mother tongue.
Yeah.
Um, and so I enjoyed everything, but then you had to keep dropping subjects, so we had to leave history and geography after 10th. And in those days, after 10th, you had to choose between math and biology.
Yeah.
And I actually greatly liked mathematics also, but I liked
Mm-hmm.
biology perhaps a little bit more. So I chose biology, and then I finished 12th standard. Then I opted to do botany rather than zoology for my undergrad honors
Wow.
simply because I was scared of not being able to handle dissections of very small insects in zoology honors. And I thought cutting sections of stems was perhaps a little bit easier. So I ended up doing botany, although in some sense I was more interested in animals.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the one thing that 3 years of BSc in botany convinced me was that under no circumstances can I do a master's in botany. The thought of doing all this stuff again in greater detail was just not interesting. And at that point in time, uh, there was one course I did in second year undergrad, which was genetics, which I really enjoyed because it was, unlike a lot of the classical biology syllabus, it involved a lot of understanding rather than just memorizing a lot of
Memorizing.
facts.
Yes. Yes.
So I thought I would like to do genetics for my master's, and there
Mm-hmm.
was a newly opened course in MSc genetics in Delhi University South Campus. Uh, but it was by no means clear that one would get in. There were only four seats,
Okay.
and admission at that time was by marks you got in your BSc. And it never struck me that not everybody might be interested in genetics like I was. So I thought, four seats. So the botany topper, the zoology topper, the anthropology topper, and one second rank holder. That's it. That's four seats gone. And I was like the fourth rank holder in the university in botany honors. So I was like,
Amazing.
there's no way I'm getting in. Then I started wondering, then in that case, what do I do? And I actually thought about it and made up my mind and decided that if I cannot get into genetics, I will switch out of science and do MA either in philosophy or in Urdu literature.
Wow.
And I actually talked to my dad about this, and he was like, "Yeah, fine. I mean, you do whatever interests you." And then, as it
Fascinating.
turned out, not everybody wanted to do genetics. Some people wanted to do biochemistry or microbiology also. Some, like the botany topper, actually dropped out of science and she
Wow.
just
Is it?
didn't
Okay.
didn't, didn't enroll for. Apparently, she got married and and
Okay.
and left studying, unfortunately. And
Mm.
so actually I got in, and even my colleague here at JNC, who was another one or two ranks below me in the honors list in botany, also got in. That was Professor
Wow.
Anuranjan Anand.
Anuranjan. Wow.
So
Okay.
Anuranjan and I were classmates both in BSc and MSc. And then we ended up in JNC after some
JNCSL.
years together.
Amazing.
And
Amazing.
there was this one very entertaining period of several years when he was the chair of the molecular biology and genetics unit, and I was the chair of the evolutionary and
Evolutionary
organismal
biology.
biology unit.
Yes. Yes.
Uh,
Wonderful.
so, so I got
Yeah.
admission, and then I got into this course in genetics. And then
Hmm.
during our first year, we had one full course. This was still the annual system on population and quantitative genetics, which was magnificently taught by Professor C.R. Babu
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and
This is in Delhi University.
Delhi University.
Ah, yeah, yeah.
So I got really interested in population genetics, and a lot of the molecular genetics that we didn't. I mean, it was interesting to learn about molecular genetics, but the kind of work involved, pipetting zero point 0.5
Mm-hmm.
microliters from here to there, and that kind of thing didn't appeal to me very much.
Okay.
And because of the interest in population genetics, I then got interested in evolution and decided to try to do my PhD in the broad area of evolution. And actually, at
Mhm.
that point, Professor Babu advised me, saying in his usual style, he said, "Yeah, Baba, if you want to study evolution, go abroad." I say, "There's nobody doing evolution in India."
Was that
And
the case? Not many were doing.
almost, almost,
Oh,
almost.
okay. Okay. That's
And
very interesting. Very interesting.
so
So,
then I ended up going abroad
going
and shifting into evolutionary biology.
evolution. Yeah, we'll go and kind of try to also go little deeper in the making of a a good biology student, because I would be very interested in knowing what way, for example, a student who is really looking up to become a biologist, from your viewpoint, what are the necessary kind of foundations which are important? Because given the fact that you have not only a broad understanding of biology, but also you have been able to interface kind of mathematical biology and statistical analysis with evolution and ecology, what kind of foundation does it really take to become so effective in such broad areas?
I think there's no clean single answer to that question. It probably
Hmm.
varies a lot from person to person. Um, I think an interest in biology comes about at least in two fairly different ways. One is
Hmm.
just curiosity and fascination about living things. You
Yes, yes.
grow up seeing living things, and especially when I was a kid in the 70s, we lived in university quarters, which were these little standalone houses but with large garden area around them. So, and this was on the outskirts of town.
Yes.
So there were a
Yes.
lot of animals in the garden all the time, lot of birds. Many things about them are
Many
quite
things. Yeah.
fascinating. So I used to keep observing. There was a little tree in our backyard, and I used to climb up that tree so that I could look
Mhm.
over the very high boundary wall. And
Nice.
behind
Nice.
that boundary wall, there was sort of open land all the way down kilometer or 2 kilometers down to the river. And this was open land with some open nalas.
Nalas.
And
Okay.
a lot of people used to come and dump carcasses of cattle there. And
Wow. Okay.
so that area used to attract a lot of vultures. And this was a
Hmm.
time when vultures were still very numerous in India. Nowadays, you don't see
You
vultures
know,
that
yeah.
much.
True.
There
True.
used to be several hundred vultures around that place. And I used to be quite fascinated actually by the vultures. I
Hmm.
spent a lot
Hmm.
of time just upon the tree watching the vultures, how they come down, how they eat, how they fight with the dogs for the
Yes. Yes.
carcasses. And then so
I,
you observe all kinds of things. And at the same time, I think when you go a little bit deeper, when you get
yeah.
into college or so on, you start appreciating that at the same time, underlying all this immense diversity of life forms and structures and behaviors and appearances, there are also conceptual principles that are somewhat more limited by which we understand all of this.
All of this. Yes.
And
Yes.
in my case, those conceptual principles started really interesting me.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
in some sense, I have always, at least since the time I was in college, I have actually been more interested by the concepts that we use to understand the living world rather than the living world itself in some strange way.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, if somebody reads your web page, that's beautifully put. In fact, I would urge the listeners to have a look at it. In fact, Amitabh tells that I do not view science as a career. I view it in a way a classical musician would view music. I'm interested in evolutionary process per se, rather than this or that taxon or trait complex. That is a very beautiful way of looking at the problem, right?
Well, that's kind of how I got into it.
I Okay,
Uh,
okay,
See, many people actually come into ecology and evolution in a very different way because they're really interested in wildlife or what
true, true.
organisms do, all the
Yes,
fascinating stuff that happens in nature. And
nature.
that is how they come into ecology and evolution. In my case,
Absolutely.
I actually came in through because the mathematical theory of population genetics really tickled me when I was a student. So I came in from an interest in population
Interest.
genetics.
Genetics.
And
Yes.
honestly, at that time, I didn't even know what kind of research people did in evolution. I had no clue.
Okay, okay. But
And
the aspect which is very intriguing is, see, even as general students growing up in schools, the biology component actually connects very well with the curiosity of a child. In fact, somehow being in a natural environment. In fact, I'm amazed that you could see vultures probably in Agra. That's the place,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
because I don't think it's very usual for anybody to watch vultures at such a close proximity nowadays, and that is quite amazing. And this part of that being close to somewhere where you can observe is something very interesting, and I'm always kind of intrigued by people who have such proximity. I'm sure that would have had some influence on you too, right?
No, I'm sure it works. And see, Agra in the 70s, although it had a large population, but it was in
Hmm.
many ways a small town.
Down. Okay.
For example, when I was a very young child,
Hmm.
in the morning, there would be a guy who brought his few cows and buffaloes house to house in the neighborhood and delivered the milk direct from the animal at your doorstep. Then it changed. By the time I was about 10 years old, we would go to that guy's yard where he had all the cows and buffaloes with our buckets and get the milk and bring it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
by the time I was, I think, in high school or intermediate, was when these dairies started, and then they started, a guy on a bicycle would come with a
Okay.
big barrel of milk on the back of his carrier, and then eventually got replaced by plastic packaging when I was in college. But for example, I realized when I went to college in Delhi that
Uh-huh.
for Delhi kids, all this was, you know, they were my age, but they had grown up with bottled milk coming out of a vending machine. Um,
Wow.
and this hit me when during MSc we had gone for some field work to the tribal belt of Odisha, and we were staying in a small village and going out every day to meet tribals, and do our projects.
Hmm. Hmm.
And we were sitting in the house of one of the village, chieftains.
Hmm.
There was this little calf, bachda,
Uh-huh.
in
Yeah.
his
Yeah.
backyard. And our juniors, who were all Delhi born and bred, they were so excited. They were taking photographs of this bachra, and I was thinking, bachra hai. I mean, what is so remarkable about? Because we saw. I mean, when I was a kid, I have seen pigs giving birth in our
Wow.
front yard, which was a very
Uh,
fascinating experience actually. And I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, and
okay.
this pregnant sow for some reason came to one corner of our yard behind a bush and decided to give birth there, and we all went and watched.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
was fascinating to see, the first piglet is born and the mother actually bites the umbilical cord.
Wow. Okay.
And
Okay.
even more interestingly, the subsequent piglets which are born, because they have a litter of more than one
Hmm.
piglet, the first piglet actually bites the umbilical cord of the others.
Wow.
I was completely, like, totally zapped by this. I mean, I still remember it. This was like maybe 50 years ago or 51 years
Oh man,
ago.
that I'm a bit very shockingly surprised to know that a newborn actually cuts the umbilical cord.
Yeah, although I mean, many newborn mammals, unlike us, are
Mm.
very precocious.
Yeah,
They get up and start walking within a
walking.
few
Yeah, yeah,
minutes and so
yeah,
on.
yeah. That's true. That's true.
So yeah, many
That
of
is
these things, I think, in a small town, it was just. And then the other very, I mean, it's very strange to connect these things to biology, but for example, we used to go and get our meat from traditional butchers in one
yeah.
gully called Kasai Pada.
Uh huh.
And there are
Okay.
all
Okay.
these little butcher shops with the goats hanging in
Ah,
front of the
yes.
shop.
Yes.
So you go there, and I used to initially go with my parents or sometimes with our servant who used to go, and I got really intrigued by all of this. And after a while, when I was a teenager, I only used to go by bicycle and buy the meat for the house every day, every second day or so. And it was very fascinating because this was a in your face demonstration of mammalian anatomy right there. You saw these
Yes. Yes.
split open goats, you saw how the organs were arranged in the body, you figured
Mm-hmm.
out which was which, and you realize that the way these organs are arranged in the body is actually nothing like what it looks like in a 2D sketch in your
This
textbook.
sketch. Absolutely.
And I
Absolutely.
think those visits to the butcher shop were a fantastic introduction to mammalian anatomy, frankly.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. Now, during such kind of periods where uh, I'm just trying to kind of relate this to the childhood. It's also a very intriguing period of one's life where the understanding is not complete, but the intrigue is maximum. That actually brings in a completely different viewpoint because if you want to induce curiosity, it's not an easy thing, but creates some kind of very interesting situation, right?
Yeah, I think, I mean, a couple of things that I observed, albeit with a sample size of one, on my son when he was
Yeah,
growing up. Uh, I think one, kids are extremely logical.
yeah, yeah.
We often think kids are not logical. It's not because they lack logic. What happens is because their baseline of factual information is not as big as the
As
grown
big
ups.
as.
They often start with the wrong axiom
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and very logically proceed to what is
Process.
therefore a wrong conclusion because the axiom was wrong where you
Interesting.
began from. But the logic is usually extremely impeccable even with fairly young kids. And this was
Nice.
fascinating for me to see when my son was growing up. The other thing I realized is that, there are times when kids have a curiosity about some particular thing and they are asking. That
Mm-hmm.
is the time to tell them about it. You can't
Yeah.
sit a kid down when he's not interested and say, aha, come sit. Today I will tell you about the beauties of quantum mechanics. That's not how it works.
That's not gonna happen. That's not.
Someday your kid might come and say, in school we read that, light is both a particle and a wave, and I'm totally freaked out by this. So what the hell is this? That is the time when you start talking about it. You should
Fantastic.
take the cue from the kid
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
and try to address what they are curious about at that point in time according to their curiosity, not when you think you want to impart some knowledge to them. It doesn't work.
Fabulous. Fabulous. No, Amitabh, double clicking on this very important point is how do we then kind of educate people, and right from, let's say, a very young age and even to an adult age. In fact, part of the effort in this particular podcast is to reach out to people who may be interested in science and who might be adults. How should we then cultivate this particular viewpoint? This is something which is extremely important in my opinion too. You may want to just elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, I'll be happy to elaborate, but with the caveat that what I'm saying is my view on
Yeah.
this, and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't make any claim that this view is particularly either original or universal.
Okay.
There could be many, better or at least equally valid perspectives on this.
Okay.
Uh, One thing that I personally believe, based on my experience in life, is uh,
Yeah.
we are all victims or prisoners of our own backgrounds and our experiences.
Yes. Yes.
In terms of how does one get interested in science, I mean, this is first of all my take on this, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
not to suggest that it's the only take or the best take. And also, I strongly believe that all of us, the way we think about things, to a great extent, we are prisoners of our backgrounds and our experiences. They
Absolutely.
shape the way we think. Given that, see, one of my fairly early memories of childhood, and this continued throughout childhood with my dad, was he always told us that you should never do something just because I am asking you to do it and I'm your father. Uh,
Nice.
his point was that if I ask you to do something, I will also give you an explanation why I want you to do
Why
it in
you're
this way, and you should do it if it makes sense to you, not just because Papa said it, we have to do it. That's not how you do things, that's not how you lead your life. And this sort of went into our heads, both me and my brother, at a very early age. And I think this approach is what we need with regard to science. See, in some sense, uh, science requires a certain combination of skepticism and rationality.
true.
Uh,
True.
and both are important. Skepticism without rationality just makes you an irritating person and a cynic at
Yeah.
best. Uh,
Yes.
Rationality, but without skepticism, often also doesn't take you very far. You need both. But the most important thing, I think, is, for example, if we look at what happens in school, because
Yeah.
let's also face the simple reality that for a lot of kids who did not have the benefit that perhaps some of us like me had of having a very, very enlightened academic background at home,
Home.
uh,
Yes.
which
Yes.
is quite rare. Uh, for many kids, what they are getting in terms of their education is primarily from school, not
School.
primarily from home. And many
True.
parents are very busy, they are not terribly educated themselves. They are sort of like, okay, we have put you in a good school, it's school's
Mm.
responsibility to educate you. But in school, how we are taught science, uh, we are not taught science as a process. We are taught science as a collection of information, as knowledge. I mean, the way we are taught science in school, we could as well be being taught religion. You know, there
Exactly.
was
Yeah.
this guy called Newton, there was this great guy called Darwin, there was this great guy called Lavoisier, and they figured this all out, and this is how the world works. Remember it, regurgitate it in the exam, and that's it. Now you know science. But then
Yeah.
this is, I mean, science. I think the part about science that often people outside of science, and many people even inside science, in my opinion, don't get at all, is that science is not about the factual information about the world. It's about the conceptualizations
Mission.
by which we try to make sense of the patterns in which the facts present themselves to us. So the
Absolutely.
science is in our
Absolutely.
heads. It's not out there in the real world. It's not in
Real one.
those facts. I mean, the facts are experienced and assessed by every living thing, and every living thing also reacts to those facts.
True.
They all
True.
respond to their environments in various ways. So the science is not in the facts. It's not a collection of facts. It's the process of how we make sense of those facts.
Very
And
nice. Very nice.
this aspect, I think, is completely lacking throughout most of our education.
Education. Yes. Yes. So,
And
in order to really grasp this concepts, one of the kind of dichotomy is the balance between the breadth and the depth. So, how should one balance that part of it, especially at a primary education? If you look at it, books are flooded with information. But somehow, how does a development happen where the child is kind of encouraged to ask questions, go a little deeper?
yeah, I think, see, again, the problem is that we focus too much in school with conveying factual information
True.
rather than saying, let's tone down the factual information in detail as much as possible, and rather focus our education on teaching kids how to think.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think about something? How do you you know I mean, for example, we all learn in school at some point about the fact that actually the earth goes around the sun and stuff like that. But then you could as well talk to kids and say that, look, where does the sun rise, where does it set,
Mm-hmm.
now can you think about this, now can you think
Yes.
of some counter argument to this, and so on and so forth. Because actually the idea that the sun goes around the earth makes perfect sense at
Yes.
a basic level,
Yes, yeah.
which is why it
It
was what people thought for so long. And
absolutely right.
and
Absolutely.
so the emphasis should be on what constitutes evidence.
Mm. Mm.
How do we think about problems and stuff like that? Again, the process of science is more important rather than the end product of
End
where
product.
our understanding happens to be today. The other
Absolutely.
aspect of science, which I think again people outside of science completely fail to grasp, and that's largely our fault because we never tell it to them,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
is that scientific knowledge is provisional, number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, science is not dealing with the truth. This is a very, my experience has been, I actually talk about some of this stuff when I start teaching statistics to our PhD students.
Yes.
And
Yes.
the first 3 or 4 hours of the statistics course are actually about how do we construct a scientific understanding of anything,
Understand.
and why does statistics become important in that.
Important.
And
Mm.
and this usually comes as a shock to most incoming PhD students to be told
Hmm.
that science is not dealing with the truth.
Hmm.
And if you want to look for truth, either go to religions who claim to be dealing in the truth, although you might get dissatisfied,
Yeah.
or you will find truth in the tautologies that are otherwise called mathematical theorems.
Mathematics. Yeah.
They
True.
are true precisely because they are tautologies.
Exactly. Exactly.
But in science, the operating question that we ask of our explanation of any phenomenon is
Hmm.
not is it true? The question is does it work?
Work.
And by
Okay.
does it work, we have a very specific meaning. Can we make reasonably accurate predictions? And do they work out? So the
Yes. Yes.
operational question is a pragmatic one. It's does it work, not is the explanation true? And tomorrow there might be another explanation different from this one which works even better
Yes.
or
Yes.
works in a wider domain, in which case we will supersede the older explanation for the better one. So scientific knowledge is always provisional, and this is something that uh, regular people, I mean, who are not trained
Yes.
in science, have a hard time understanding because their
Understanding.
reaction is, oh, these scientists keep changing their mind. See,
Mind.
when COVID started, they were saying something, now they are saying something else. These people are idiots, they don't even know what they are saying. Right? And
Absolutely right.
on the contrary, if a scientist said, I know exactly how this happens, this is what is going to happen, I would say, "Mm, I don't think you are a very good scientist, you know.
It's not a sign of a good scientist at all in that
Right,
sense.
right. I mean, science is never dealing in certainties.
Absolutely
But
right. Absolutely.
unfortunately, human nature is such that we demand certainties. If you go to a doctor and the doctor says, you have a very strange constellation of symptoms, I'm not quite clear what's wrong with you. I have
Hmm.
two, three ideas, and we can try to check them out. And most people would guy who gave this guy a medical license.
Like this.
What they want to hear is, you have disease X.
Yeah.
This is the medicine for disease X. Take it for 5 days, you'll be fine. And they say, what a good doctor. Uh,
Yes. Yes.
but then again, I mean, as a biologist who has a hard enough time understanding even a small insect, I would say anybody who has that kind of confidence about understanding a largish mammal like a human being is basically not being truthful.
Truthful.
Um, I would be much happier if the doctor said, look, I really don't know what the hell is going on, but here are some ideas which we can try to test.
Yes. Yes.
But that
But
is not how people see science. People see science as some repository of grand truths to
yes.
be worshipped, you know, as a superior form of truth than perhaps
Truth.
more traditional ones. But then that destroys the very essence of science. I mean, you remember at JNC when you walk in from the front gate, there's this
Yes.
little
Yes.
stone saying, I too have worshipped at the
Worship
shrine
it.
of science. I've always felt upset with that
Yeah.
particular
Yeah.
quote. I mean, I understand the spirit in which Nehru said it at that time and the
Yes. Yes.
context, but I don't like that quote.
Yes. Yes.
We do not worship at the altar of science. We do not
Exactly.
believe in science.
Yeah.
When people say, I believe in XYZ theory of science, what they really mean is this particular theory has been tested many number of times, has turned out to work really well. So I'm reasonably confident that it
Yes.
works well. It's not belief in the sense of faith.
Absolutely right. See, this is a very crucial issue when it comes to the way humanity looks at certainty, right?
Yeah.
Because statistical thinking and probabilistic thinking probably are not inherent to human beings. Given that
Absolutely.
you have a perspective not only as an evolutionary biologist, but also as a person who actually is kind of a rational, but equally kind of poetic in nature, how should one look at this paradigm?
No, I completely agree with you. I think, see, uh, our brains, all said and done, like the rest of our bodies,
Yeah.
have evolved over a period of time. And for the vast majority of our evolutionary history, we were not living in an environment remotely similar to the one we live in the last couple of hundred years, or even the last 2000 years. I mean, 99 point some percent of our evolutionary history, we were hunter gatherers primarily.
Yes, yes,
Now, what comes naturally to us? See, for example, it's very clear that linear thinking comes very naturally to us.
naturally, absolutely,
Non-linear thinking requires some amount of training, and it can
absolutely,
lead you astray. Your intuitions can blow up in
yes,
your face with non-linear phenomena. But
absolutely,
linear
absolutely.
thinking is the most natural for us. Second is deterministic thinking comes very naturally to us
Natural to us.
rather
Yes,
than probabilistic thinking. Third thing which comes really naturally to us is thinking about phenomena or objects that are roughly on a similar order of magnitude spatial scale as ourselves,
yes,
and on a time scale roughly on the scale of our lifespans.
lives. Yeah,
The very large time or space scales and the very small time or space scales, our intuition tends to go part, which is why quantum physics and astrophysics tends to, blow your mind when you first encounter them. Uh,
absolutely, absolutely.
uh, Now, why is that? One can imagine, this is of course a speculation, but one can imagine that the ability to think about stuff that's happening on our time scale, our spatial scale, think according to rules of thumb that are deterministic. Large four-legged animal coming towards me, a threat, run away.
Nice.
Now,
Okay.
if I was to sit there and, some weird caveman sat there and said, wait a minute, what is the likelihood that this is actually a large herbivore and not a large predator? And in the meantime, while he's figuring out the probability distribution, he's been eaten. And so that particular attribute has not made
Yes.
its way to the next generation.
Next
I
generation.
mean, this is a hypothetical caricature,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
uh, so
No,
in
this
some
is this,
sense,
this
I
is
think
truly fascinating. Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's a reason why certain things come intuitively to us and
Hmm.
others we need to be trained in. But having said that, I mean, again, one of the things that happens repeatedly when I start teaching probability as part of the statistics course, I spend a lot of time trying to get people to sort of become comfortable with the fact that probability is not about a set of mathematical techniques to solve problems. It's a way of looking at the
Looking at
universe,
things.
which
Very
is
true.
different from the deterministic way. And it's in its
Absolutely.
own way a very beautiful way of looking at the universe, where you see all phenomena as probability distributions associated with random variables and so on, and then you realize that the deterministic worldview in some sense is an extreme variant of that, where you can assume that the probability distribution is sort of concentrated at one value, but it takes a long time to get that shift in thinking
Yes.
as to
Yes.
how this works. And I agree. I think all of these, see, probability to my mind should be taught beginning with fifth, sixth standard, and
Yes.
it can
Yes.
be beautifully taught with little games, little card
Games.
tricks, and the concepts, the ideas, not the formulae, not the technicality. Those you can pick up later. But if you get the basic ideas when you are really young, see, there is some qualitative difference in how you internalize concepts when you are young versus when you are a little bit older. Maybe the difference between when you are 10 years old versus 25.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I felt this very strongly because, as I said, I had dropped mathematics after 10th standard. So
Oh, is it?
my formal education never proceeded beyond basic algebra and basic geometry and basic arithmetic, little bit of trigonometry. So 11th, 12th would be where you would do calculus and you
Hmm.
would do linear algebra and all that stuff, which I didn't because we had to drop math if we wanted to take biology. And then I went through BSc and MSc, MSc, we did have one course on this so-called biostatistics and biomathematics. None of it made any sense at all.
Okay.
Because the problem was it was being taught by people who were used to teaching statistics students or mathematics students,
Hmm.
not
Hmm.
biology students who had not taken math out at
Not
10th
take that.
standard. You have to teach differently.
Yes. Yes.
Then I ended up in the US doing a PhD and realized that, I need to make up for some of these lacunae in my education, because in ecology and evolution, there's actually quite a lot of formal mathematical theory.
Mathematics. Yes.
So I actually did like basic 100 and 200 level undergrad courses, Calculus 101, Calculus 102,
Wow.
Linear Algebra 201, probability theory, and stuff like that when I was a grad student. And
That's
I
unusual.
I realized at that time that the way you understood stuff when you were 14 or 15 is not quite the same when you are 23, 24 years old. Something has
Absolutely.
already changed. Even though
Same.
23, 24, you are still young, but the brain's ability to internalize concepts is already, beginning to decline. Uh,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
and it is known that a lot of changes happen in the wiring of the brain around puberty, which affect many things. So, for example, prior to puberty, if you live in a different country and you naturally learn their language, you will speak it like a native.
Yes.
After puberty, if you move to a new country and you learn the language, you become absolutely fluent in it, you will never speak it like a native. There'll be a slight difference.
Is it? Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
this is
It's very
very
interesting.
well studied. Something
Oh.
changes around puberty
Uh-huh.
with regard to
Wow.
the accent and other
Accent.
things. You
Yeah,
you
even
will
voice
always
voice
be,
breaks, right?
yeah,
Even the
you will
voice.
always
Yeah.
correct. And there's also something more. So you, after puberty, however proficient you become in the language,
Mm-hmm.
you will always be recognizable as a really fluent non-native speaker. But
Wow.
if you learn it before puberty, you'll be
No.
indistinguishable from a native speaker.
Wonderful, wonderful. This is something very interesting because you also mentioned, uh, knowledge acquisition is kind of provisional, right? That is an important point what you're mentioning, and you also mentioned specifically the revisionist aspect, while grasping concepts and other things, and the fact that people have difficulty in appreciating this actually has created a lot of misconceptions about science. In fact, uh, I was very surprised. For example, people did not have any specific problem in vaccination in India, for example, where there was almost unanimous support for a vaccination program, and this has been there for ages now in India. But if you look at, let's say, some countries, including some of the educated countries in Europe, actually there is a lot of inhibition towards appreciation of vaccination. What is missing there? What is an issue there? Can you please give your thoughts on that?
I have no idea. I mean, to me, it's incomprehensible.
Mm-hmm.
My only speculation is that perhaps they are so far removed in generational time from the memories of these diseases that they have forgotten what vaccines
Mm-hmm.
accomplished.
Yeah, yeah.
When I was a child in school in the 1970s, every class had at least two, three, four kids who were partially crippled by polio.
Polio, yes, even
Every
I have.
class, every section had them. We all had classmates who used to walk somehow with braces on their legs.
Yes.
And today, you don't
Yeah.
see people suffering from polio. So I think maybe for some of us, it's fresher in our minds what
What?
vaccination achieved. Maybe for some of the more advanced countries, perhaps, I don't know. I mean, I'm just making a guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe
No, no.
that memory is much longer back. But yeah, I find it incomprehensible that even countries in Europe, I find that more incomprehensible than the fact that there's an anti-vax movement in America. Actually,
Exactly. Yeah.
uh, even in Spain, there's a fairly large
Yes.
anti-vax
Yes.
community, which I find
Exactly.
amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. But what was your experience having lived in America? Because that was probably a formative years as you became kind of a mature evolutionary biologist, and also learning new things. Was America what it is now? Yeah, for sure, there's a lot of change, I suppose.
Well, I'm sure there's been a lot of change, but the roots of some of these changes, I think, were apparent at that time. So I basically lived in the US between 1987 and 1995.
Okay. Okay.
And much of this time, I lived in this very small town in eastern Washington state called Pullman, which was
Hmm.
really a university campus plus a few houses and shops. So this
Interesting.
was this was one of these towns. I used to find it very funny when people said Davis in California is a university town. Davis has a population of about 100,000.
Okay.
Uh, Pullman had a population of about 25,000, of which 20,000 was the university.
University.
And
Yeah.
there were other towns within 50, 60, 70 miles of Pullman that had populations of 267, 310. You know, what one building in India would have.
Yeah.
And then I spent 2 years in Irvine in Southern California, which was very different from Pullman. So
Yeah.
Pullman was a very small town. The area around it was largely agricultural.
Hmm.
And I mean, it was an interesting experience. Um, it was academically a fantastic experience.
Okay. Okay.
Um, I was very fortunate in that I worked with people who were very nice, at least to me.
Okay. Okay.
You see, this is also something I think that often, on social media and so on, you read all these things about mentors and toxic mentors and nice mentors and all that.
Yeah.
It's often a lot more fine grained than that. You can have
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
guy who is a really good mentor for X and Y, but not for Z.
Not
It
for
doesn't
the
work out with Z for some reason. Could be
absolutely.
personality differences, could be something or the other, so at least speaking for myself, all the three people I worked closely with during
Hmm.
those 9 years were fantastic. They were very nice to me, and academically they were great. Also, I think what really helped was that there were very different kinds of people with whom I worked. So one
Interesting.
of my mentors was an experimental evolutionist who worked with fruit flies, which is
Hmm.
the kind of work I have continued to do
Yeah.
because I found that approach very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
He also did some theory, but this was the kind of theory that is done by a good experimenter.
Hmm.
It was
Hmm.
informed by experiment.
Experiments. Okay.
And
Okay.
see, often there are very interesting questions in any area of science which may not perhaps be theoretically terribly challenging for a theoretician to take up, because there's a certain
Absolutely.
professional pride also that one has in what one does. But the answer to that is important to the experimenter who actually works with the real systems.
Oh
So
man, that
he,
is something very
yeah,
important. Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Uh, my other mentor was so this first one was Professor Larry Muller.
Hmm.
My other mentor was Professor John Thompson, who was a field ecologist.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
Basically, did most of his research work in the field with a little bit of supporting work in the lab, and he worked on basically plant insect coevolution.
Yes.
And in his lab, other grad students worked on all kinds of things. So most of the grad students, me included, didn't work on what he used to work on. And my
Nice.
third mentor was actually a mathematician who was a real theoretical population geneticist, but his basic degrees were in math.
Wow. Okay.
And I worked with all three. I ended up doing some work which I published with all three. And I think the fact that I got to learn from these three people who came from very different backgrounds,
Hmm.
approached evolution in their own different ways, I think I learned a lot because of this.
This. Okay.
Had I been stuck in one kind of lab where they just did Drosophila work, probably I would have been much narrower in my thinking. And
True.
I
True.
think, I mean, this worked out really very, very fantastically. Apart from that, I mean, I'm not very social by nature, so I spend a lot of time with myself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So to that extent, and I was also really busy as an experimental
Yeah. Yeah.
scientist working with living things, and for most of my PhD, I was not actually in a Drosophila lab, although I was doing Drosophila work.
Oh, okay.
What
Okay.
that meant was that there was no backup. I couldn't pick up the phone and say, "Boss, I'm taking off for 2 days on a brief vacation. Can you look after the flies for me?" That option wasn't there. If you are
Okay. Okay.
actually in a fly lab, you can always do that because there are five
Yes.
other grad students,
Other
all of
people.
whom are working with flies. They know what to do. I,
Absolutely.
I didn't have
Absolutely.
that option. So I basically could not really take off much time. Um, all the time I was doing my PhD, I never once came back to India during that entire 6 years.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's no way
That's
I could come for a month or so. What would happen to my flies? Nobody else could handle them. Uh, so I mean, in some sense, what that also left you was, see, and I mean, one learned different kinds of things from these different people. From Mike Moody, who was the one who trained as a mathematician.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The most important thing I sort of absorbed through interactions with him was not so much mathematical techniques, which frankly I'm still really poor at mathematical techniques. But what I, to some degree, absorbed from him was the ability to take a problem
Mm-hmm.
and examine its logical structure, not just
Yeah.
its physical structure. So,
Okay.
to every problem, there is a certain physical structure of the problem and there is a logical structure. And often, two problems with differing physical structures might map onto the same logical
Same.
structure,
Absolutely.
and,
Absolutely.
and so on. And what I learned from him was that it's important to also see the logical structure of the problem, figure out which of the biological details are actually important, which are not, and
Nice.
focus on what is the, how you know, sort of reconnoiter around a problem, find the logical weak spot where if you tap, the problem will suddenly cleave itself into a clean solution. uh, this is an aspect of science that often I think people just don't convey very much, but it's
Oh,
important to
very.
think about the logical
Yeah.
structure
Yeah.
of problems
No, this
as
is
well.
this is something very very critical of while studying any problem, right? Continuing on the same aspects of your US experience, could you please also elaborate a little bit more? Yeah.
Yeah, so on the other side, as I was saying, I mean, I tended to spend a lot of time with myself, um, but obviously I was following news, and this was an interesting period. I mean, when the first Gulf War happened, 1991, I was in the US, and of course it was all over the media. CNN had just started, and I actually had some experience of Iraq
How?
in the 1980s. My father was a visiting faculty in the Muslim Syria University in Baghdad for a couple of years, and I had spent the summer there.
Interesting. Okay. Iraq. Iraq.
Yeah, yeah. So it was quite fascinating to watch how suddenly in late 1990 the media demonization of Saddam Hussein began in America.
Hmm.
The how it culminated and so on. It was quite fascinating to watch.
But was it normal there? Kind of very liberal, right? There was actually quite a lot of openness in the society then. Uh,
Not when it really, not when it came too much to foreign policy.
okay. Okay.
Uh, and bear in mind that my experience was of a university campus where you're actually dealing with perhaps the more liberal, more educated people. Uh,
Okay.
um, I mean, one thing that I noticed about the US, which to me was very strange, was that people were very cynical about the motivations and statements of their governments when it came to domestic policies,
Yeah. Yeah.
but almost astonishingly naive about believing whatever their government said when it came to foreign policy.
Foreign policy.
There's a complete disconnect between how people respond to what the government tells them when it's domestic policy related versus when it's foreign policy related. So basically, I mean, the government can wake up one day and say, look, leader X is
Mm.
evil, and most people just believe it.
True.
The
True.
same government says, we are doing this to help you. Half of America will be, no, this is a conspiracy to remove our freedoms from us.
Yes. Yes.
So this was one very interesting thing that I observed.
That's
The
similar. Even now it's same, right? It's almost.
Probably I see. I haven't been back to the US since I finished my postdoc
Oh,
and came home.
is it?
Yeah,
You haven't gone
I
back?
haven't gone back to the US since 1996 January when I
Okay.
came back. After that, I have traveled occasionally in Europe or other parts of Asia, but I haven't been back to the US.
Oh, interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. Um, I mean, to begin with, I wasn't a great fan of US foreign policy even before I
Yeah.
had gone there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was it was interesting. The other thing that was actually quite interesting was, right now there's a lot of tension in the US that you see between the so-called liberals and the so-called right wing or whatever. So one of the interesting things that I figured out after going to the US actually is that these words like liberal and conservative are very context specific.
Context. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
the set of attributes that come under the label of, say, liberal in one country can be
Mm.
very different from the set of
Different.
attributes that come under that label in another country.
Absolutely.
It took
Absolutely.
a while to realize because initially the naive thing was that, oh, liberal means liberal in India or in the US, but then after a while you start realizing that it seems to imply fairly different things.
True.
Uh,
True.
I mean, in India, liberal at that time pretty much meant somebody who was not terribly religious or
Yeah.
didn't pay too much attention to issues of religion and caste in day-to-day
Mm.
life and so on. That was more what liberal in India meant in the 1980s. In the US, it seemed to have a very different connotation.
Yeah. This means that you probably would have had also some kind of an experience of their local culture, because the places where you were living was also not kind of something like hugely populated, but you may have got a gist of how they live and what is their thinking and things like that.
Yeah, no, and again, it's a very strange combination of several things. So the bulk of my experience was in eastern Washington, next door to northern Idaho, which is largely very less populated, very beautiful landscapes, mountains, lakes, rich agriculture, and my experience there was, people were very nice,
Hmm.
and I mean, we had this really old second-hand car which used to keep breaking down in the middle of nowhere every now and then.
Okay.
And random people from nearby villages would, find us on the side of a highway with the blinkers on and come and help out. I mean, we once had a case where a guy actually towed us to his house, put us up for a night, and then actually went to the nearest town, got the spare parts needed, and then helped repair the car. And this was on New Year's Day, New Year's
Wow.
Eve, and New Year's Day, and then actually refused to take any money even for the spare parts he bought, saying that, oh, it's a Christian thing, we are supposed to help people in need. And so my experience with people in this sort of, really small town, rural
Mhm.
parts of the Pacific Northwest was that people were amazingly friendly
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
really nice. And this is very strange because, again, this coexisted with the fact that northern Idaho, about 50 kilometers from east of Pullman, northeast, was this town called Coeur d'Alene in northern Idaho, which was the headquarters of the Aryan Nation and full of these, white supremacist neo-Nazi type
Oh,
people.
okay.
And I mean, I and my family were very obviously not white, um,
Okay.
even if we were not entirely black. And
Uh,
we've been to Coeur d'Alene multiple times. You
mhm.
saw people on the streets in Coeur d'Alene is also a very small town, very beautiful town,
Okay.
surrounded by mountains. And you see people strolling around on the street wearing, SS uniforms and Nazi stuff on their
Wow.
arms and
Is
so
it?
on. But
Nobody
never
paid attention.
heard of anybody, doing anything violently to somebody there while
Okay.
I was while I was there. So there was again this very interesting juxtaposition. I mean, that area was also in many ways a hotbed of white nationalists, but
Mhm.
they seem to be relatively non-violent white nationalists who are more interested in dressing up in World War II German uniforms and waving swastika flags, and rather than actually attacking people
Attacking.
of other races.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it was very strange. I mean, in some ways, it was almost surreal. Um, but
Wow. That's
but
unusual, right? For
yeah,
1980s and
yeah, yeah.
90s. Yeah.
Um,
Fascinating.
the the other thing I also realized, and I think in the US, the mindset in these smaller towns and villages is very different from the big metropolitan areas on the west coast or the east coast.
Mhm.
Um, so, for example, there was this elderly janitor who used to clean our building at night, and I
Okay.
was often in the lab at night.
Mhm.
And so we started talking and we became friends. And he used to ask all kinds of stuff about India and this and that. And we used to talk to him. He was a very, very nice guy. He must have been about 60
Okay.
or
Okay.
maybe a little over 60. But at the same time, so this guy was from northern Idaho. And this was around the time where there was a very famous incident where some federal agents came and surrounded some guy in Idaho on his farm and eventually shot him dead. And this was a big thing in the local news at the time. And at that point, happened to be talking with this guy about this stuff, and he suddenly started saying things which were an eye opener to me. So his thesis seemed to be that the real enemy of all Americans is the federal government.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
federal government has sold America out to the black Africans at the United Nations.
Okay.
And any one of these days, the federal government is going to come in with these black African UN troops to take away my land and my farm. And if they do that, I'm going to defend my land, and I have the guns, I have the weapons, and I'm going to defend my land. And again, it was to me as an outsider a very strange contrast because this was a very nice guy,
Uh-huh. Okay.
uh,
Okay.
extremely pleasant. I had so many conversations with him late at night in the lab,
Yeah.
and I used to admire the way he did his work. I
But
mean, he
yeah.
took so
Yeah.
much pride in his work. He would literally polish every tap in the bathroom sink and then look at it from three different angles to see if it was properly polished. He clearly took a lot of pride in his work,
What? Okay.
and he actually found it quite hilarious what we were paid as PhD students compared to what he was paid as a janitor. And he was like, "You got to be kidding me."
Kidding. You.
But then suddenly on this issue of this federal government, this
Uh,
guy transforms into somebody who seems to genuinely believe that one of these days he's going to have to take up guns to fight
wow.
against the federal government of his country.
Wow. That
And
element of conspiracy is something which is very prevalent. Even a large section of America, although it has some of the most brilliant people, but also a lot of people
yeah,
who have wrong impressions.
no, and I was actually reminded of this a few years later when I was a postdoc. There was this very famous terrorist attack in
Mm.
Oklahoma, I think.
Ah, yes, yes, yeah, yeah.
Timothy McVeigh.
Okay, yeah.
And so this guy blew up a federal building in Oklahoma City or whatever. And initially, I remember on TV, on the local channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS, even before anything was known except that somebody had put a bomb and
Hmm.
blown up the federal building, everybody was already arguing about which Palestinian faction it was.
Wow,
So
wow.
this was, of course, the pre-Al Qaeda days. So the
I guess,
Palestinian factions were the big thing. So it was like, is
yeah.
it the PFLP or is it, is it Fatah? Is it some lesser
Hmm.
known faction? And then it turns out it's this white guy called Timothy McVeigh. After that, there were multiple congressional hearings on these so-called militias in various states,
Hmm.
which came into prominence because of this guy's interrogation. And at that time, I was listening to many of these things on TV, on C-SPAN actually, which just relayed
Yes,
the
Eastman.
congressional hearings.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was suddenly reminded by a lot of these militia people and what they were saying to Congress of this guy from northern Idaho. It was the
Hmm.
same mindset that we need the weapons to protect our land and our families from the federal government, which really doesn't represent us.
Oh man.
And
Okay.
this thinking seems to be reasonably widespread in many parts of small town America, outside the
Oh, okay,
metropolitan areas.
okay. That's kind of also a bit dangerous, right? Because that can really lead to some kind of unrest. If
True, but if you think about it, I mean, think about the mindsets in a small village in rural
Hmm.
UP and the mindsets in Bangalore.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
They're going to be quite different.
yeah, yeah. So
But yeah, it was
going.
interesting. I mean, there were all these interesting observations to make. And one of the other things that actually surprised me, I mean, prior to going to the US,
Mm,
uh, we didn't have any relatives who lived there. So we
okay,
had no first hand accounts of
account.
the
Okay.
US. So whatever you saw of the US was largely through the lens of popular culture, music, bands, movies, Hollywood
Mm,
movies, and so on. One of the things that actually struck me when I did go to the US, and perhaps even more so because I spent the first 6 years in small town America,
mm-hmm.
was it's a deeply religious country.
Religious kind.
I
Yes,
had not appreciated that until I went there,
yes.
because that's not the impression you would get by seeing typical Hollywood movies.
Hollywood. Absolutely, absolutely.
It's actually a deeply religious country.
In fact,
Uh,
my experience in Midwest was very similar. Even the impression what you get, for example, you go to LA or New York, is
yeah.
completely different from some other parts of the US. You're
Yes,
right.
yes,
You're right.
absolutely.
Yeah. So going further, if we want to really understand the making of Professor Joshi as an evolutionary biologist, now you are making your transition as a postdoc from US to India directly, or are you spending some time elsewhere?
No, I did a 2 year postdoc and then
Okay.
joined JNC after that.
Nice, nice. So tell us a little bit about your transition from US to here, Amitabh. Like how was it? Because 1997, right? That is the time you're heading back, and
96 Jan.
96 Jan. Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So how was it? Like how was that transition?
Transition was fine. It was, as usual, a slightly weird story. As I said, I never planned things too much.
Okay,
So
okay.
initially, when I was doing my postdoc, I didn't have any particular plans of coming back to India.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Simply because, I mean, if you're an evolutionary biologist, the US was really the place to be academically speaking. I mean, it was a powerhouse of evolutionary
All right. Yeah,
biology.
yeah.
Um, and I had done pretty well as a PhD student. I was doing well as a postdoc in terms of getting stuff done and publishing stuff
Mm-hmm.
and so on.
Okay.
So I fancied that my chances of getting a faculty job were reasonably decent.
Okay.
And being a good experimentalist, I
Mm.
did an experiment to check this out. So when I was about 1 year into my postdoc,
Mm-hmm.
I applied for 5 faculty positions that were advertised.
Okay. Okay.
Even though at that time I had relatively few publications,
Mm.
they were more in the pipeline. But
Mm.
I just wanted to see. I didn't expect that I was going to get an offer. I just wanted to see whether it looks like I will be marketable, 2 years down the line.
Okay. Okay.
So this was around the end of my first year as a postdoc. I applied to 5 places. I made it to the top 5 or top 6 shortlist in
Mm.
three of those places, and I
Okay.
actually got interviewed in one of the places.
Okay. Okay. And that's
And
like
of
one
course,
year
I,
into your
I
postdoc. Yeah.
pardon, one
One
year
year
into
into your
one year
post.
into my postdoc.
Okay. Okay.
So that gave me the confidence. Of course, even in the place where I interviewed, I didn't get the job. But it gave me the confidence that 2 years down the line, when I have more publications, I will
Yeah.
be
Oh, yeah.
competitive in this. So I didn't particularly have any great idea of coming back. I was enjoying working there. I like the academic atmosphere at that
Mm.
time.
Yeah.
As a postdoc and grad student, of course, you're not exposed to some of the other parts of the academic atmosphere, which may not be so pleasant, which I didn't realize then. But then certain things happened, and for completely personal reasons, I decided that I needed to come back to India.
Okay. Okay.
This was in '95,
Mm.
and so I decided that I was going back to India around October, November of '95, and then basically told Larry that if I'm going back, then I might as well go back quickly. So I'll just wrap up whatever experiments I'm doing. I'll train a new technician to run the lab because that's what I had been doing as a postdoc.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll like to go as soon as possible. And so this was around October or so, and early January I came back. So
Okay.
I had not set up a job or anything in India when I came back. I just came back, and I didn't even have any understanding of how the academic hiring system in India was. Whether institutions hired only against vacancies or they could hire interesting people if they happened to show up. I had no clue about anything,
Is
and
it okay?
all my friends in the US, the Indian friends, were saying you are an idiot. You should fix up a job while you are still at UC Irvine and
Yeah.
have that address. And I was like, look, my logic is very simple. I should be marketable because of what I am and what I do and can do, not because my address is UC Irvine. That's the way I look at it. And
Yeah.
given that I'm going back, I would rather go back quickly because at that time my family was already here in India.
Mm-hmm.
So I came back, and then I didn't know the only person I was aware of who was doing anything evolutionary in India because I occasionally saw his papers in some journals, although those were areas that I didn't work in, but they were
Okay.
evolutionary biology, was Professor Gadakkar
Correct.
at the
Yes.
Center
Yes.
for Ecological Sciences. So I went and met him
Mm.
and sort of said, want some advice. How does one go about looking for a job here?
Nice. Mm.
And Professor Gadakkar was exceedingly nice to me, and he said, one of the things that is important for looking for a job that you should have some academic address
Mm.
rather than house number 74 Sanjay Nagar. And so let's make you a visiting fellow in CES.
Wow. Okay.
And so before the day was done, I was installed in CES in a small visitors room opposite their library in the old CES building.
Okay.
And so so this didn't involve any money.
Mm. Mm.
They weren't paying me anything, but I got an office, I got access to email, and I
Good.
got an
Good.
address, an academic
Address.
address. And then I spent about 2 3 months there, and then it was Professor Gadakar who told me about this new institution called JNC that was just coming up.
Yeah.
And he said that, we are starting an animal behavior unit. Why don't you apply there? And so I applied here and then interviewed here, and got the job. And that was it. Ever since then, I've been in JNC. So I got lucky. It worked out fine.
Yes.
Uh, and Yeah, I think,
This is
see, luck has a lot to do with what happens in life. Um,
absolutely, absolutely. So, one of the concerns, and this is actually a very valid concerns among PhD students and postdocs, is that what is the prospect of them getting a position in India? If you look at what you just mentioned, you were essentially kind of a free spirit and also not very bothered about where you're going to end up. Nowadays there is a lot of stress on students, especially PhD students and postdocs. How should they look at this concern? Because I can understand one can take that risk, but also it comes with the personality of the person. But it might not be a kind of a solution to the problem. How should one approach that problem, Amitabh?
See, I think everybody has to figure out how they want to deal with it, because a lot depends on your circumstances, your personality, your priorities in life, and the general situation. And as I
Absolutely.
said, at that time, this was 25 years ago, the situation was a little bit different. I mean, it was competitive even then, but not perhaps the way it is right now. Uh, and also, I think, I mean, I was extremely lucky
Hmm.
at many points in my career. I think I got really lucky. Um, and so it turns out that not being very pragmatic and not planning too much happened to work out for me, because I was really lucky. That doesn't mean that's a great strategy to follow for
Strategy.
everybody. You might not get lucky. The
Yeah.
circumstances might be different. Plus, given your, different individuals differ in what responsibilities they have at any given point in time in their lives. Um, what their priorities are. So I think these are things that people have to figure out for
Figure
themselves.
out. Absolutely.
What risk you are willing to take, what risk you are not willing to take, what compromise you are willing to make, what compromise you are not willing to make. See, the
Lyric make.
compromises I am willing to make may not be the same ones that you are willing to make.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
So our reaction and our decision in face of the same problem could
Mm,
be very
mm.
different because of that.
True. True. This is very critical, and also kind of connects to the point that there is kind of a randomness also kind of involved in all these things. Because see, for example, one can not really plan it to the T, so to speak, because you would not be able to really think in the framework, and also plan things in very very tight kind of schedule and other things,
Yeah.
no matter how
No,
well your plan is. Yeah.
no, I used to have this discussion a lot with a friend of mine whom I knew from PhD days in Pullman. He was a electrical engineering guy. Actually,
Mhm.
he's one of the people from whom I learned quite a lot of nonlinear dynamics through these
Ah, okay,
conversations.
okay.
So he was working for a medical instrumentation company in Irvine when I was a postdoc. So we used to often get together on Friday evenings and have dinner somewhere, and you
Nice.
know have a few drinks, listen to
Mm.
music, whatever. Both of us had been part of a small music group in Pullman. He used to play tabla. I used to kind of, sort of pretend to play keyboards.
Nice, nice. Mhm.
So Amit was a very organized guy. So he used to keep asking me this kind of question. So where do you see yourself in
Mm.
5 years?
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
was like, boss, I don't even understand that question. I mean, tomorrow I might get hit by a car while I'm crossing the road and
yeah.
get killed. So I don't think that far ahead.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
so if you ask me, what do you see yourself doing in another 5 years? My best guess would be probably I'll still be doing research somewhere
Somewhere.
where I have no idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he sort of planned his career progression very well, and evidently it worked out for him. He now has his own very successful medical instrumentation company in the US.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so I guess, I mean, his planning really worked out for him.
True.
And I
True.
think my lack of planning with a lot of luck worked out for me too. So I don't have
Yeah,
any
absolutely.
complaints.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is something which is very critical to kind of realize that you can have very different ways in which you can chart your paths. In fact, that is also equally critical for people to realize, because sometimes there is too much of emulation in the way one would want to achieve something, but there
Yeah,
is probably lack of self reflection, which sometimes kind of creates a lot of
yeah.
problem. Yeah.
No, I'm actually really slightly amazed by this because over the years I have been watching this. I mean, see, one of the privileges you get as an academician is that you keep interacting with subsequent cohorts of students.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I've been here now for more than 25 years.
Mm, mm.
And I've been noticing a change that's become more pronounced in the last 10 to 15 years is that increasingly students seem to want somebody else to tell them what to decide.
What?
So
Yes.
students come to you and they say, I have these three offers from these three universities. Which one should I choose? And I'm like, boss, it's your life.
You're
You
right.
know, you are the one who is going to suffer or enjoy
Right.
the good or bad effects of your choice. So why do you want me to make the choice for you? I mean,
Absolutely.
I find that incomprehensible, but
Yeah.
this seems
Yeah.
to have become quite common now.
Absolutely.
Um, and I'm not sure what is driving this. I don't understand what's driving it at all. I wondered about it, but I haven't been able to really come up with any good hypothesis for it.
No, no, this is true even with undergraduates. I should mention, because even here, apart from the PhD students whom we interact, there's a lot of kind of, see, probably there's also a lot of peer pressure, and they would want to also kind of, benchmark themselves compared to, let's say, somebody else, and want to make
Yeah,
kind of progress in that way. But if you look at the way higher education is placed in India, which is in a very interesting kind of crossroad, where there is also an education policy which has been put forth. What is your thought, Amitabh? What do you think about that? Is that really helping us to really progress in the way we should, or what are the positives and negatives going forward if we take that?
positives or negatives of what?
The NEP,
If you
National Education Policy.
Um, okay, I did study the draft NEP quite carefully because at one time I was involved with many other colleagues
Okay,
um
okay.
in writing a formal response
Hmm, hmm.
to the NEP on behalf of the three science academies, which was submitted to
Yeah,
the government.
yeah, yeah.
So that time I did study it. I found it not a very interesting document, to be honest.
Hmm, hmm.
Um,
Yeah. So we are discussing about the NMP policy, and you were mentioning something. Yeah.
yeah, no. So the NEP itself, I wasn't terribly impressed at the time when I read it in great detail. I'm not sure if it got changed a little bit later. That time it was the draft NEP.
Okay.
I
Okay.
haven't really gone back and looked at it afterwards. But
Okay.
I think there's a broader issue on which in India, as a society, we have never had a proper discussion, and that is the issue of what exactly do we want from our education system at school, at university,
That's
college level. What is it that we want from it? Uh,
true. True.
So it seems that we want education to do multiple things, which are actually somewhat mutually contradictory, in the sense that the same education system will not be the best for all those things. So on the one hand, it seems like we want education system to produce good, educated, aware citizens,
Yeah. Yeah.
which it doesn't seem to be doing. Um, on the other hand, we want to quote unquote sort of have technically reasonably qualified people for the 21st century workforce. Um, and the third thing is, of course, we also need the education system to produce the next cohorts or
Of
generations of intellectuals, of scholars.
yeah, yeah,
And to my mind, the attributes of an educational system that would give rise to each of these three are actually very different. So, the same system, if you're trying to have it do all three, it will do all three of them badly,
true,
which
true,
to my mind is what has been happening.
happening.
Now,
But
what is
do you,
the.
do
Yeah,
you, do you
tell me.
also think that there is enough thought behind all the policies which is now kind of put forth? There has been a lot of work. I can see a lot of competent people also are involved in it. But what is your thought, Amitabh? In what way it can probably be implemented would also make a difference, right?
See, one problem is that the best ideas, if not implemented properly, don't really
Yeah,
work out. That
true, true.
is always a problem, all the more so in a large and sort of very complex country like India. Implementation is an issue often for many things, not just for education. The second thing is, and I'm not sure there's an easy solution to any of this is, but see, typically what happens is when you get a bunch of people together, I mean, this is just an empirical observation, not a value judgment.
Yeah, yeah,
You get a bunch of people together on a committee where the purpose is to, let us say, draft a syllabus for a particular course, or these kinds of meetings happen in boards of studies of universities and
yeah,
so on.
yeah. That's right.
uh,
That's right.
in the few times that I have been part of such committees, I always start by asking whoever is chairing the committee, who is usually somebody from that university,
Yeah, yeah.
what do you want this course to achieve? And they
Hmm.
always look at you as if, what kind of an idiot question is that? But to my mind, unless you first answer that question, what is the point of discussing how to frame the course and the curriculum and the syllabus and all that?
Yeah,
The other thing I noticed is that what tends to happen in most of these committees is, see, people, supposing the committee, I mean, I'm just making
yeah,
up an
yeah,
example.
yeah,
Supposing the committee is for a course in genomics, a new master's course in genomics or something.
yeah, yeah,
Now, what will happen is that there'll be various professors there. There'll be a professor of microbiology from the University of Biochemistry, Genetics, zoology, whatever. Often, instead of everybody thinking, how can we make this the best possible genomics course that could exist given our constraints in our university, the thinking will be more like, as the microbiology professor, can I ensure that at least three papers of microbiology should be part of this curriculum? Next
curriculum.
guy is, can I ensure that enough of zoology should be there? So there are these, the committee members see themselves in some ways as representing parochial interests of their parent departments, rather than focusing on how to best make this new course.
New course. Yeah, yeah.
And this, as I said, I mean, this is not a value judgment, it's an empirical observation. But I think this ends up reducing our ability to actually come up with interesting new courses, even in principle, let alone the implementation problems.
True, true. That is a very interesting way of looking at the issue, because if you also see the way a student consumes, it's now a word, consume, right? Because it's become almost like a business. Because the way they actually also take in the input, maybe what is really being taught in the class is already available in various different resources, but the way a course is kind of kind of targeted towards them, maybe giving a new perspective, like asking new questions and other things, play a very critical role, right? In that sense, probably these kind of thought processes are very important, and probably will have a deeper ramification on way things actually have to move in the direction in the way they're supposed to. Yeah,
See, one possibility that suggests itself to me, at least as something worth discussing and thinking about, is whether to sort of bifurcate higher education. I'm talking about post 12th standard education,
Hmm.
typically in college or universities, uh, and have sort of the bulk of the institutions focusing on sort of that role of producing reasonably technically well qualified workforce for the 21st century, equipping people for a variety of jobs in the
Yes.
job marketplace, and then have a much smaller setup whose job is to prepare the next generation of scholars in different disciplines. And the numbers of those scholars obviously are going to be orders of magnitude less than the numbers of people for the marketplace, for the job market.
Job market.
So
Yes.
you
Yes.
could have a much smaller set of institutions who tailor their way of education to saying, we are not preparing you to get a job in the job market, we are preparing you to be an academician. And the bulk of the institutions could say, we are not even going to pretend that we are trying to make you an academician. We are only focused on giving you good chances in the job market.
Yeah.
Maybe that's one possible way.
Possible.
I mean, my only thing that I feel is that I think these kinds of discussions just don't happen in India about what
India.
is it that we want from the
Yeah.
education system. It just
No,
sort
no,
of
that is
runs along on autopilot. Uh,
absolutely. And no, also the fact that there is a different kind of people looking up to education for different reasons, right?
Absolutely.
Because that probably is also an important question to be addressed in the way you will cater to the requirement of the people who are really taking it and things like that.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And in many cases, I think for many of us, what happened was that over the years we figured out some way of balancing the system with our interest in knowledge for knowledge's sake and so on. But then you, in some sense, you end up becoming an academician despite the system, not because of the system.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
You figure out how to sidestep the system and satisfy your thirst for knowledge, and
College.
while also doing enough to get reasonably decent marks so that you don't get, kicked
Absolutely.
out of the programs. But yeah, it's a, and I think again we have to appreciate that, as you just said, different people are seeking an education for very different
Different
purposes.
race. Yeah, yeah.
Some might be seeking it for purpose of knowledge, those small subset of people who want to become academicians. But many others are seeking it as a means to a good livelihood. And I mean, there's nothing wrong in that. One should not be looking down upon that in any sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Uh,
Absolutely.
that's a very legitimate point of view, and that is a point of view that is, espoused by far greater number of people than the small number of people who want to become academicians.
Yes.
But I
Yes.
think we have to figure out some way for the education system to cater to all of these, and at least at the school level, maybe cut down on a lot of the detail and focus more on how to think critically, how to evaluate claims.
Yes.
How to evaluate claims, in fact, today has become even more important because, as you mentioned, today information is easily available. In earlier days, information was not easily available to everybody. So the
True.
teacher had a certain role also as the repository
Agree.
of
Yes.
quote unquote verified information.
Information. Yes.
That role is now gone.
Gone. Gone.
Information is at everybody's fingertips. But
Absolutely.
then comes the question of how do you verify the information? How do you evaluate the veracity of that information? Those are the things we should be teaching in school.
In school.
How do
Yeah.
you find information? How do you check it out? How do you evaluate it? How do you separate the information from the the misinformation. And once you have a lot of information, what is the difference between information and knowledge?
Absolutely.
This is
Absolutely.
something we should be talking about in
Talking
school
about.
level.
Absolutely.
There is this great lament in a poem by T.S. Eliot,
Mm-hmm.
who says, "Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where
Mm.
is the knowledge we have lost in information?"
Nice, nice, nice.
And
That's beautifully put. In fact, that also is, brings us to the next aspect of where we're going to head towards this conversation. Is your research and the kind of problems you have chosen over the years, and the mentorship what you have kind of provided to a lot of people who have had flourishing kind of careers of their own. What is your general philosophy of choosing a problem and interacting with students or any kind of colleague or anything? That is something which is kind of fascinating to me, because I've seen that many of the people who have worked with you, the one thing which always kind of is evident in that conversation with people who have worked with you is that the kind of breadth of knowledge they are able to kind of uh, have, not only as one way channel but two way channel, in the sense there is a lot of interesting things get exchanged in the process of research. And that is something consistently I've seen a lot of students of yours telling that. So give us a little bit about your philosophy of how you approach research, and how do you approach mentorship and things like that.
so I think again, one is a prisoner of one's background and experiences. So, one of the things that I greatly enjoyed during my stay as a grad student in the US
Okay.
was the fact that the professors treated you as their intellectual equal.
Eco. Yeah, yeah.
Uh, Perhaps obviously you are less experienced than they are at that point in life. Uh, you are quite a bit younger, maybe by 12, 13 years. All the people I worked with were about 12 to 14 years older than me at that point.
Okay, okay.
So they were relatively young
Mhm.
also. Uh, but they treated you as an intellectual equal. That was one thing which was a huge change from the way most professors in India used to treat us when we were MSc or BSc students.
Nice, nice.
And that I really appreciated a great deal. Uh, the second thing, I mean, few of the things which shaped my approach to mentoring and to research in general were things I imbibed from Larry Muller.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So one of my first experiences with Larry when I joined his lab as a fresh grad student in '87 was, I had been there for about a week or so, and uh, we had heard in India that Americans are very professional and very punctual and all that. So
Yeah.
every morning, I was not a morning person, but every morning I would set an alarm and somehow get up and make sure I was in the lab at 9 in the morning. And I would make sure that I would leave only after Larry had left,
Okay, okay.
and so on. You also please appreciate this is the pre-internet era,
Yes,
so we
yes.
don't have much real idea about what life somewhere in some other country is like. So we had
Absolutely.
this thing in our heads that, oh,
Notion. Yeah,
these guys are very serious about punctuality and professionalism and work ethic and all that,
yeah.
and we should not sort of create a bad impression for ourselves and our country by going there and appearing to be lazy or something. And then 1 or 2 weeks after I had been there, I wanted to buy a small camera so that I could take some photographs and send them home to my parents. So there was this technician one suite who used to work in the lab, and I was working with him, learning how to handle flies and all that at that time. So one day I asked him, "Is there some shop nearby where I can get a small cheap camera?" And
Okay.
he said, "Yeah, there is a place, but it's actually about 3, 4 miles away, so it's too far to walk." And he said, "You know what? I'm going that side in the afternoon to get some supplies for the lab. Why don't you come along with me? I'll give you a drive there. You buy your camera and come back with me." So I said, "Okay."
Okay.
So I went to Larry's office and Um, he said, I wanted to buy this camera, photograph, parents, this, that. So if you don't mind, I'll go with Vaughn at 3 o'clock. We'll be back in an hour or so. And he sort of listened to me patiently and then smiled and said, you know what? This is a lab, not a military camp.
Oh
You
man.
don't have to tell me when you are coming and going. You just go and come as you please. And then he said something that stayed with me. He said, look, my assumption is you have come from all the way across the world to do a PhD here. Obviously, you are serious about what you're
Serious
trying
about
to
it.
do. So I'm
Absolutely.
sure you will do what you need to do, and you don't have to come and report to the lab at this time and leave at that time. You come and go as you please.
Nice. Nice.
And this really stayed with me. I love that statement that this is a lab, not a military camp.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
And then I had one more experience with Larry about month and a half later. So I had gotten quite comfortable with handling the flies and all that. So then, like a good Indian student, you grew up with this concept that Guruji will tell some problem to work on. So I
Yeah.
go to Larry and I said that, I'm really comfortable now with the flies and I've all that. So can you suggest some problem for me to work on?
Uh-huh.
And Larry was leaning back in his chair. He was a very tall guy,
Hmm.
long hair and a mustache. And he was leaning back in his chair and he just looked at me and said, hey, it's your PhD. You think of something.
Wow.
And
Okay.
initially, I was a little taken aback, and then I sort
Yeah.
of went downstairs, had a cup of coffee, thought about it, and then I said, no, actually, makes sense. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's my PhD. I should be the one figuring out what I want to work on.
Yes. Yes.
So that was another thing I absorbed. A third thing I absorbed actually was from another mentor, John Thompson, with whom I ended up completing my PhD, or rather restarting my PhD after working with Larry for a year and a half. And when John agreed to take me on as a grad student, because I wanted to go back to Pullman for financial reasons from Irvine, his only condition was that if you're working with me, you have to do something related to species interactions,
Mm-hmm.
which meant changing subfields a little bit. And so I said, that's fine, but I would like to continue working with fruit flies. And his response to that again was something that stuck with me. He said, this is not the time to discuss that. First, decide on a question that is
Yes.
interesting. Then
Nice.
we will figure out what's the best system with which to address that question.
Address that.
And if it turns out that fruit flies are a good system, great, work with fruit flies. But if it turns out that there's some other better system, then I will suggest you work with that better system. And again, I sort of said, yeah, makes sense. The question is more important.
More important than no. This is something central to a lot of stuff. What we do as researchers is to actually have question as a guiding principle to further choices. In fact,
Exactly.
it's kind of sometimes surprising that this is not inherent part of
But
one's thinking.
a lot of the times you see in many labs,
Yeah.
uh, people end up, it's sort of, I know this bunch of techniques, and so this is going to determine what I work on.
Mark on. Yes. Yes.
My approach has always been, um, let's find an interesting question that we find interesting. Of course, you may not find it interesting, somebody else may not, but
Yeah. Yeah.
then we figure out what are the best tools required, and if necessary, we'll learn some new tools while we are figuring out how to solve this question.
True.
I think you keep learning new tools.
New tools. Exact. Exact.
There
No,
was a
that's.
time in my life when I knew nothing about time series analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then we realized that given some of our research interests, it was important for us to understand how to analyze time series data. And
Absolutely.
we ended up, learning how to do time series analysis and learning lots of interesting things along the way. So
Absolutely.
you
In fact,
keep learning methods.
there is a kind of a saying which is like to paraphrase, anybody who knows why will figure out anyhow kind of thing. So they will be able to kind of figure out what is possible. In fact, that is something to elaborate on, because evolutionary biology in India, especially the people, including you, Professor Gadakar, and many other people, have actually put a lot of emphasis on this way of thinking, where you first choose a problem which is also kind of a feasible problem to approach within your environment, and then give good thought about it and design an experiment and execute it. you know Being a physicist myself, this approach sometimes brings in the question, oh, whether when physics people can do it, or any person who actually is kind of slightly more inclined towards engineering or other things, might find this approach a little bit counterintuitive. But I should mention that this approach does work. This approach does have value within a specific framework of questions what one can ask. I'm not generalizing this, but this has a lot of value. Do you see this kind of semblance also there in your fellow biologists, especially people who do a kind of uh, biology at molecular level or cellular level? Do you see that appreciation of this particular fact?
I have found, and this was reasonably true in the US also.
Okay.
I had a lot of opportunities to compare because I actually did my PhD in a department of genetics and cell biology.
Genetics. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Genetics and cell biology.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
almost all the faculty and almost all the grad students there were what you might call reductionist or
Hmm.
molecular cellular kind of biologists.
Okay. Okay.
And I think there are two very different kinds of biology.
Okay.
For historical reasons, historical accident, if you like, we think of biology as one science, whereas we think of there being two different non-life sciences called physics and chemistry. Now, of course, physics and chemistry overlap in many areas. The boundary
Yes.
between them is fuzzy. There are sort of these interstitial spaces where it's hard to say whether it's physics or chemistry. But we are very comfortable with the idea, for historical reasons, that there is a non-life science called physics and a different non-life science called chemistry.
Chemist. Yes.
Similarly, there are actually two different life sciences. There is a biology which is primarily trying to deal with questions of how living things are alive,
Nice.
which you
Nice.
might call mechanistic biology,
Biology.
or you
Mm-hmm.
might call slightly more reductionistic biology, which is trying to work out at the molecular or cellular levels the fundamental processes of life. But then there is another biology, and this biology is trying to address a different set of questions about the living world. So, one, when you look at the living world, several things hit you in the face. One is, oh, living things are alive, they are not like stones or
Stones. Yeah.
bricks or rocks or water bodies. They are alive. So, how are they alive? What does it mean to, what is the difference between a living matter and a non living matter? That is one question which biology is trying to address, and that is one kind of biology.
Yes.
The other
Yes.
kind of biology is trying to address the following three observables about the living world. One is that the living world is very diverse in terms of life forms. The world is not covered with one species of bacteria. There
Yes.
are so
Yes.
many kinds of species.
Species.
Why are there so many kinds of species? Secondly, this diversity of species along any axis that you want to examine at is not random. It has a structuring to it.
Structure.
That is why you can have classification schemes where you and I will both agree that if I give you a human being, a dog, a mouse, a frog, a fruit fly, a butterfly, and a pea plant, we can say that the man and the dog are more similar to each other than they are to everything else. The frog is more similar to the man and the dog than it is to the insect.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
have this kind of potential of a classificatory hierarchical scheme based on measures of greater or lesser similarity.
Similarities.
Why is it that this diversity comes in this scheme? Why is it not a random diversity?
Interesting. Interesting.
This is one question that any science calling itself biology has to address.
Address.
Third
Yes.
observable about the living world is that by and large, most life forms or species seem to have characteristics, whether structural or behavioral or biochemical or physiological, whatever kind of characteristics, that seem to be reasonably well suited to their way of life.
Nice.
In other
Nice.
words, most species seem to be reasonably well adapted.
Adapted. Okay.
So, any science that is trying to say, I am biology, the study of life,
Hmm.
it needs to not only address the question of what does it mean to be alive, it also needs to address questions about the diversity, the relatedness, and the adaptedness of different life forms. This second
Wonderful. Wonderful.
kind of biology is what you might call evolution, ecology,
Ecology.
organismal biology. And these two kinds of biology are at least as different as physics and chemistry are. They have
Fantastic.
different epistemologies.
Mm-hmm.
And one reason why there is this universal observation across cultures, everybody observes this, that as an ecologist or an evolutionary biologist, you realize strangely initially that it's easier to talk about your work to a colleague from physics than
Yes.
it is to talk to a colleague from molecular biology. Even
Very
though
interesting.
we are both biologists and this guy is a physicist. Why is that? And what I have been able to figure out over the years of sort of thinking about this is I think it's because ecology and evolution share, on an average, an epistemology with many physicists. And that is the epistemology that, to sort of crudely caricature it in a nutshell, is saying when I say I understand something, it means I have a model of it.
Exact. Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
epistemology.
Hmm.
If you talk to a molecular biologist, their epistemology is slightly different. And again, I'm not making any value judgment that this epistemology is better or that is better. They are different. The molecular biologist statement is when I say that I have understood something, it means I have a detailed description of
Of that particular.
it at the
Okay.
molecular level.
Hmm.
So often when I talk to friends who are physicists, I often hear this phrase, oh, that is a mere description.
Okay.
A biologist will never say that because to
Yes.
them, description is the understanding.
Understanding. Yes.
That's what
Yes.
they are after, the description. We are after a model from which we can make predictions. So our
Prediction.
epistemology is similar to that of physics, and I think that is why it is easier for us to talk about work
Top
to physicists, even
physicist.
though the systems we study are obviously very different. You know, a physicist is studying a physical system, we are studying some living system. But I think this is the reason why it works, and molecular biologists find it much easier to talk to chemists.
Yes. Yes. You're right. You're right. Absolutely. Absolutely correct. It's a fascinating connection what you're making here, because it also tells you the way knowledge is networked, right? Because
Yeah,
the way it actually is networked.
absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think it's see again, at least at higher education level, college, university, and so on, I wish people took more opportunity to teach some aspects of epistemology and what it means to construct a scientific understanding, and the
Understand.
fact that different disciplines answer that question in different ways.
Ways.
You know,
Very fascinating. Very fascinating. In fact, this approach of looking at connections is so crucial, because I very vividly remember one of the conversations I had when I was a PhD student with you. In fact, one of the concepts I was introduced about was the propagation of virus in computer programs, had a very interesting parallel in natural kind of systems.
Yes,
I
natural. It is natural selection.
exactly. That's a very fascinating thing. What
As
you
a
mentioned.
matter of fact, if you have two bank accounts
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that offer you different rates of interest,
Okay.
that's also natural selection.
Wow. Okay. Okay.
Uh,
That's fascinating. Fascinating.
because after some time, all your money will be in the account with the higher rate of interest,
All
even if
right.
you started off with equal amounts of money in both. Uh,
Wonderful. Wonderful.
but no, I think there's a broader point here. If you will permit me to
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Sure.
tell
Please.
another
Please.
story.
Please.
See, in genetics, we are all familiar with Mendel's work,
Yes.
so-called
Yes.
Mendel's laws of inheritance, who figured out these important principles of how inheritance works. Now, the story is actually quite fascinating because Mendel was from a rural community. He was a farmer's son, and like many younger sons of farmers, was basically given to the church to become
Yes.
a
Yes.
monk, and he became a monk. But he was rooted in gardening and other things and so on. And now the question that arises is, see, when Mendel did his crosses and found these 3:1 ratios and all that,
Yeah. Yeah.
there was nothing novel about the data Mendel was looking at.
Oh.
Everybody and
Okay.
everybody's aunt in the last 100 years was looking at the same kind of data.
Theta. Yes.
Even Darwin, almost around the same time as Mendel,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
had done similar kinds of crosses, had even quantified the data and realized that they seem to occur in a 3:1 ratio of the two types, and then gave up because he didn't know what to make of it.
Make of it. Okay. Okay.
Hybridization experiments were a big thing
Mm.
among both plant and animal breeders at that time. So, what I'm trying to say is that there was nothing unique about the data that Mendel had. What was
Nice.
unique was what he did with it.
Wow.
So, the
Mm.
crazy thing that Mendel did, and this is amazing in the context of mid 19th century biology in particular,
Mm-hmm.
is he took these observations of ratios and then created a model which could
Okay.
explain these ratios.
Ratios. Okay. Okay.
Now, that model, even more remarkably for mid 19th century biology, first of all, making a model is itself amazing.
Amazing.
It's a stochastic model, it's a probabilistic model.
Probabilistic one. Wonderful. Wonderful.
So, Mendel, this guy who is a monk sitting in a monastery in the Austro Hungarian Empire, now in the Czech Republic, is
Yes.
coming up with a probabilistic model that would explain how characters segregate in subsequent generations. And as it turns out, his model accurately mimics the behavior of paired chromosomes during meiotic cell division when
Mm.
sperms or eggs are produced. And his model is proposed about 30 years before meiosis was first described and
Describe.
observed.
Wow.
Okay. Now the question is, why did Mendel come up with this and not any of the very renowned scientists of that time like Nageli and others who were working on this and who all had similar kinds of data?
Data.
Now comes the crazy part of the story, and I'm reasonably convinced that this is not merely a coincidence.
Okay. Okay.
So Mendel wanted to, like many monks, he wanted to become a teacher in the local high school.
Okay. Okay.
And in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to become a high school teacher, you had to have a university degree. So the monastery funded Mendel to go to Vienna, the
Hmm. Hmm.
capital, for a university education. And the first year when Mendel actually appeared before the interview board, he was asked a lot of questions about plant taxonomy and all, and he failed in the exam, was sent back,
Okay. Okay.
and was very dejected. Then he came back the next year and he survived the interview and he joined. So Mendel did an undergraduate course of study in Vienna
Okay.
in the early mid 19th century,
Mm-hmm.
and his major subject was physics.
Okay, okay, interesting.
Mendel worked as a lab demonstrator to earn his, assistantship, as a
Assistantship, yeah.
lab demonstrator for practical courses by Doppler, and he
Fascinating.
attended
Doppler.
thermodynamics courses by Boltzmann.
Wow, wow,
Now,
wow.
suddenly, it is no longer surprising that he comes up with stochastic models, because
Absolutely.
he has gotten some exposure to the fact that you can model things that might appear very complex in a very
Wonderful.
statistical probabilistic way. So I mean, of course, whether this had an impact on Mendel only he knew, but
Mm,
I
mm.
don't think this is entirely a coincidence that
Coincidence.
he studied with Boltzmann and he studied thermodynamics of all things.
Wonderful.
And he
Wonderful.
becomes the only guy to come up with stochastic models to explain inheritance. And
Fantastic.
later on, one of the great thinkers of evolutionary genetics in the 20th century, Ronald Fisher,
Fisher, yes.
Fisher is on record as saying that he was greatly inspired by statistical thermodynamics.
Wow.
And many subsequent scholars have basically described Fisher's creation of the field of quantitative genetics as saying that basically what Fisher did was
Hmm.
create the statistical thermodynamics of allele frequencies.
Wow. This
So
is fascinating. Fascinating.
the reason I stress this, and I keep telling this to students also in class, is see, if you look at the history of science,
Hmm.
there are some occasions where there are big advances in science because there is new data of a kind that didn't exist before. And
Absolutely.
usually that happens when there is some technological advancement to our sensory perception. The invention of good telescope, the invention of a good microscope, they opened up new worlds to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But the bulk of scientific advances don't happen because of new data. They happen because somebody saw some weird connection between
Connection.
data that everybody was looking at. And that is
Fantastic.
why the breadth is so important
So important.
compared to just depth. Depth is also important, but breadth is actually crucial because
Good.
only then do you have some chance of making these connections.
Connections. Absolutely. So well put. So well put. This also brings us to a junction where we'll make a connection between science and poetry. And my listeners should be aware that there is no other scientist, in my opinion, in India or anywhere else, who is as well versed in poetry as much as in evolutionary biology as Amitabh. And so much so that even his own philosophy is driven. And if you look at his Twitter account, he mentions that poetry actually exceeds science in a way. And that is a philosophy which is very interesting. And I would like to ask Amitabh, what really kind of got into this domain of poetry, and especially Urdu and Persian poetry, and also Hindi poetry. What really motivated you to really kind of take interest in them? What is the background behind that?
Well, I was interested in poetry from as far back as I can remember, maybe when I was in second, third, fourth, fifth standard. And at that point, this was mostly English poetry that we encountered in school textbooks. And certain poems, particularly those that had a good rhythm to them, a good meter to them,
Yeah, yeah,
I enjoyed them, and I enjoyed reciting them in school and so on. And as I said, this was mostly English poetry. The first English poem that had a huge effect on me, in the sense that I still remember this, was maybe I was in fourth standard or third standard, and there was this poem called the Casablanca. The boy stood on the burning deck when all around him had fled, or something.
wonderful.
Uh, Somehow it moved me. I could see that little kid standing on the burning deck of a ship that is sinking and everybody is dying around him and he doesn't want to leave the ship. It just hit me somewhere.
Okay, okay,
So I was really interested, and initially this was limited to English poetry
okay, okay.
because it was what I first encountered in school. Uh, Hindi poetry, to be honest, never worked for me at all.
Oh,
It
is it?
still does.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
uh, we encountered a lot of Hindi poetry in school. Um, some of it why I couldn't really understand because the vocabulary was very Sanskritized and that was not the kind of Hindi we spoke.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
our spoken Hindi at home was very Urduized.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and somehow Hindi poetry just never worked for me. It
Okay.
never, it still doesn't work. It doesn't do
Okay.
anything. It doesn't strike a chord, which is really bizarre considering that it is my mother tongue.
Mother tongue. Yes. Yes.
Uh, so I was quite fond of English poetry. And then when I was about 10 years old, uh, I started writing small English poems, pretty
Mm-hmm.
awful ones, obviously at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But I used to write small poems, and I mean, one of the earliest poems I remember writing, which was pretty horrible. But the thing that I find interesting is that even at the age of 10,
Okay.
I had, it seems, some nascent interest in slightly philosophical poetry. So this
Okay.
one poem I remember writing that I was very happy with at that time, I was in fifth standard, was a poem called The Bug on the Wall.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's this poem about an insect on the wall.
Okay.
And the fact that when I am seeing it, it is just one insect on the wall. But if I look at the world from its perspective, it is seeing a different world from what I am seeing. That was
Nice.
the theme. The execution was horrible, 10 years old. So, but I find it interesting because I have retained an interest in poetry which is slightly philosophical.
Yes. Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
and then what happened was that at some point, when I was about 13, 14 years old, I started getting interested in Urdu poetry,
Mm-hmm.
largely driven by certain kinds of Hindi movies like Mughal Azam and George Mika Chand and so on, which had really good Urdu poets writing the lyrics of the songs and writing the dialogues. And at that point, I started reading, and there used to be this little series of books brought out by Prakash Pandit,
Mm.
small books in Devanagari script, which
Nice.
had selections of Urdu poets, a brief biography, selections from their poetry written in Devanagari script with a glossary of the more difficult Arabic or Persian words.
Nice.
So I started with that, and at that point, actually, I knew how to read and write Urdu,
Mm-hmm.
which I had learned just out of curiosity when I was about 11, and then lost interest after learning how to read and write. Then around the age of 17, I encountered Iqbal,
Mm.
and I
Mm.
was quite literally blown away by his poetry.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes.
then I wanted to read more, and I realized that he wrote very long poems. What I was reading in this series was extracts from his poems.
Poems. Okay. Nice. Nice.
Then I realized that you are not going to get Iqbal in Devanagari script in those days. So it turned out to be very convenient that I knew how to read and write Urdu.
Wow.
So when I was in first year of BSc in Delhi, I went to Urdu Bazaar near Jama Masjid, bought
Mm.
a very nice edition of the Kulliyat Iqbal, the complete works of Iqbal in Urdu,
Mm.
and then started studying Iqbal very seriously. Then I also began to read more about Iqbal.
Oh. Okay.
And one
Okay.
thing that everybody said was, see, this was the other strange thing that has always been a problem with me. Uh, when I was in school, at some point we in school did a lot of boxing.
Mm.
And then when I
Boxing.
was in 10th, 11th, 12th standard, I used to actually do karate.
Ah. Okay.
And quite characteristically, I spent more time reading about the philosophy of karate and martial arts and their historical development rather than actually practicing
That
the art itself.
that is the
So,
making of a researcher. Actually, that
yeah,
is usual with all the researchers.
exactly. I read the whole history of martial arts, how they went
Wow.
from India to China and spread, and all kinds of stuff. And
Fantastic.
so I also read a lot about Iqbal. And
Mm. Mm.
everybody kept saying that, oh, Iqbal's most grand philosophical poetry is actually in Persian, not in Urdu.
Wow.
That was why I then decided to learn Persian. Uh, and it was so that I
Fantastic.
could start enjoying Iqbal's so-called more profound poetry. And of course, learning some amount of Persian also opened the doors to a whole other literature apart from Iqbal's Persian poetry, because Persian poetry has its own amazingly
Flavor.
rich,
Yeah.
diverse tradition, both in countries outside India and also for several hundred years in India.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For a few hundred years in the medieval period, there was more Persian language publication happening in India than happening in the Iranian or the Persian
Iranian.
Empire.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
That's true. That's
so that
fascinating.
yeah. So in some sense, my interest in poetry certainly predates my interest in science,
Absolutely.
and
That's
uh, also, I mean, poetry is in fact my primary passion more so than
okay.
science.
Wonderful, wonderful. So there was a kind of a translation you had put, because I could not read Urdu. This was a long time ago. I think probably it is from Iqbal, where you had kind of displayed it on your webpage. If you don't like this world, create your own world. That was
Yes, yes,
actually,
yes, yes,
as a student, when I saw that,
yeah,
it had a very deep impression. See,
yeah.
I tried to go back and search for the page. I could not.
That
Of course,
is that
probably
is that is from Iqbal. We also used it. Prasad and I used that same quote and translation in a paper, a review paper we wrote in 2003 on what experimental evolution has taught us about life history evolution in Drosophila.
wonderful. Can you please
And
recite that? Can you
so
please recite that?
yeah, that is from Iqbal. It's from one
Yeah.
of his Persian works. It says, "Guftand jahane ma oya betumi sazad, guftan ke nami sazad, guftand ke barham zad." And the translation which I did, verse translation was, God
Okay.
asked me if I did find his universe to my liking and taste. When I said no, then he replied, create your own and lay this waste.
Wow. Wow.
And I often use this in scientific talks on experimental evolution to make the point that only poets and mathematicians have the luxury of creating their own alternate universes.
Universe.
The rest of us have
Wonderful.
to make do with model systems in the lab.
Model system. So true. So true. It's a fantastic way of actually putting the point across. And can you also tell us a little bit about the poets who have really influenced your thinking? Because you have not only depth in terms of Iqbal's kind of poetries, but also a lot of others. And you're also quite active on Twitter, where you post very beautiful poems, where I try to generally take the translation and try to understand. And could you please elaborate some others whom you feel worth kind of understanding and listening to?
Yeah, so one of the poets I really liked in English was John Keats,
Mm, mm,
uh, and some of the works of Shelley.
mm, mm.
I never particularly liked Wordsworth or Tennyson
Yeah,
that much for some reason. I don't know why. I also think Shakespeare was an amazing poet.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, most of the time we forget that Shakespeare was
Mm.
also a poet. He was not just a dramatist, and many of his dramas are actually largely in verse.
Largely, yeah, yeah.
And plus there are all those sonnets, and I like Shakespeare a great deal. Among the slightly more modern English poets, actually, I like T.S. Eliot.
Mm, mm.
I like Ezra Pound, and I particularly like Dylan Thomas.
Nice, nice.
Dylan Thomas, I think, perhaps because he was Welsh, uh, deploys the English language in a strangely interesting way.
Mm, mm.
Which is also the feeling you get when you read Khalil Gibran, for example.
Yes,
Khalil
yes.
Gibran was an Arab writing in English, but
Mm.
he uses English in a
Please.
way which is tempered with a very Arabic speaking sensibility. And I think that is very fascinating.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Um, I also like a few songwriters who I think in English who are great poets. Bob
Mm-hmm.
Dylan is a great
Oh,
favorite.
yes. Yeah.
Leonard Cohen is a great favorite, and Chris Christopherson is a great favorite. And I think all of them are really good poets as well.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
In Urdu, among the people who have influenced me, I would say Iqbal.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
uh, I have enjoyed many other poets, but
Mm, mm.
Iqbal is the one that has influenced me and the one I have spent a lot of time thinking and trying to build up further on certain of his philosophies and so on. Uh, I've also been considerably influenced by Maulana Rumi's poetry
Narumi. Yeah, okay. Okay.
and to a lesser degree by Hafiz and Khayyam and Sadi.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Rumi, actually, I think the first couplet of the
Mm,
very well known Masnavi, Maulana Rum, which
mm,
led his a later Sufi poet, Maulana Jami from Herat,
mm,
who said of Rumi, uh, Manchi goyam wasfe on Ali Janob, Neist Paighambar wale daurat kitab, मसनवी मानवी मौलवी हस्त कुरान दर जबान पहलवी. So he says, what can I say in praise of that exalted personality?
mm-hmm.
He was not a prophet, neist paighambar wale daurat kitab, but he had a book. He was
Nice.
not a
Nice.
prophet, but he had a book. And then he says, Masnaviye, Manaviye, Maulavi, the very meaningful, the full of meaning Masnavi or this epic poem of the Maulavi,
Uh-huh.
Maulana Rum,
Uh,
Hast Quran Dar Zabane Pahlavi, is like the Quran in the Persian language.
language. Nice.
So
Nice.
the Masnavi is very famous. And to me, the first couplet of the Masnavi, the first couplet of the first book, the first two lines basically of the
Mm-hmm.
Masnavi sum up the essence of what poetry is in to my mind. And these first two lines say, Bashnu inne che hikayat mi kunad, as judai ha shikayat mi kunad. So this is Bashnu inne. Listen to this reed flute.
Nice. Nice.
Bashnu inne che hikayat mi kunad. What stories it is telling.
Mm-hmm.
Listen
Mm-hmm.
to it. As judai ha shikayat mi kunad. It is complaining of separations in the plural and with a
Wow.
capital S. So he doesn't say as judai u shikayat mi kunad. He is complaining. It is complaining of a separation. He's saying it is complaining of separations in the
Chance.
plural. As judai ha shikayat mi kunad. Now you think about it, that is what all poetry to my mind is. It is a complaint about separations. It could be a
Nice.
separation of self from self,
Mm-hmm.
could be a separation of self from beloved, self from God, self from its roots, self from its friends, self from its goals, self
Nice.
from its ambitions, self from its goodness, self from its wickedness. They are all separations.
Separation.
Even
Beautiful.
the very
Beautiful.
act of speaking, when I speak to you,
Mm.
that sound is separated from my throat and goes
Nice.
to your ear. There
Nice.
is a separation involved, which then becomes a union when my sound impinges on your eardrum and you respond to it.
Beautiful.
So I think this idea that poetry speaks of separations,
Mm.
that is the story which all poetry tells. To my mind, I mean Rumi just nailed it with
Nailed
these two
it.
lines. What is poetry?
Beautiful. 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 This is also the philosophy of the highest kind, right? Because this is bringing aesthetics to philosophy is one form of a poetry, right? Poetry is essentially probably even exceeding that part of it, where even those which cannot be looked in the lens of philosophy is probably looked
Yeah.
through the poetry.
So there is this
Fascinating.
very interesting entry in Iqbal's diary.
Mm.
So Iqbal's diaries have also been published,
Yeah, yeah.
in which he and many of the entries in these diaries are sometimes in English, sometimes in Urdu. So one of the entries in his diary actually says that philosophy is a set of abstractions
Hmm.
shivering in the cold night of reason. Poetry warms it up with the fire of passion.
Beautiful. That really is, is a great summation of all the ways in which one can extract meaning out of life. In that sense, which is very, very beautifully said. Okay. So now, with this kind of platform, I would also request you to do what generally I request with many of my guests, is to just speak a few words in your mother tongue, trying to give a slightly more broader picture of what research is for you, your motivations, and also what is the kind of work you do, so that people kind of get a gist of listening to you in your mother tongue, and it gives you kind of a slightly different perspective, so to speak.
Sure. तो जैसा कि पहले कहा गया, मैं एवोल्यूशनरी बायोलॉजी में शोध कार्य करता हूँ या काविश करता हूँ। तो एवोल्यूशनरी बायोलॉजी को अगर हिंदी में कहें तो क्रमिक विकासवादी जीव विज्ञान या क्रमिक विकास इसको कहा जाता है। उर्दू में कहें तो इर्तिका इसको कहा जाता है।
Nice.
तो हम लोग इर्तिका में या क्रमिक विकासवादी जीव विज्ञान में शोध करते हैं, काविश करते हैं कुछ बहुत ही बुनियादी सवालात के जवाब हासिल करने की कोशिश में। और मेरी जो रुचि है वो हमेशा बुनियादी सवालात पे ज़्यादा रहती है। मुझे अ, सतही सवालात में उतनी रुचि नहीं आती है। तो मेरा जो शौक़ है वो ये है कि जो बहुत ही बुनियादी और बहुत ही तार्किक या कॉन्सेप्चुअल जो सवालात हैं उन पे शोध कार्य करा जाए, क्योंकि कई दफ़े विज्ञान के, साइंस के कई हिस्सों में अगर आप देखें तो जो बुनियादी सवालात हैं अक्सर उनके पूरी तरह से उनके जवाब हमारे सामने, हमारे पास नहीं है। होता क्या है साइंस में अक्सर कि एक कोई नया क्षेत्र खुलता है, उसमें शोध कार्य शुरू होता है, उसमें फटाफट कुछ कुछ चीज़ें समझ में आ जाती हैं, कुछ प्रयोग करे जाते हैं, कुछ एक्सपेरिमेंट करे जाते हैं, कुछ थ्योरी बनती हैं, और उसके बाद पूरी जो फील्ड है वो एक दूसरे जो ज़्यादा फैशनेबल कोई नया क्षेत्र खुल रहा होता है उसमें चली जाती है, और जो असली जो गूढ़ समस्याएं थी, जो गूढ़ सवाल थे, वो वैसे के वैसे रह जाते हैं, बुनियादी सवालात जो थे। तो मेरा शुरू से पीएचडी के ज़माने से ये शौक़ रहा है कि उन गूढ़ सवालों को एक बार फिर से मैं उस पे जाऊं, उस पे नए सिरे से चिंतन करूं। और इसमें मुझे मिर्ज़ा गालिब के एक शेर से बहुत प्रोत्साहन मिलता है। तो मिर्ज़ा गालिब ने ये कहा था कि वो इसमें, इस शेर में एक कहानी है बाइबल में कि हज़रत मूसा तूर की पहाड़ी पे चढ़े और उन्होंने भगवान से कहा कि भाई जलवा दिखाओ, मैं आपका जलवा देखना चाहता हूँ। और भगवान ने कहा कि मैं तुमको जलवा नहीं दिखाऊंगा, क्योंकि तुम मेरा रूप अगर देखोगे आंख से तो तुम झेल नहीं पाओगे। तो गालिब ने इस पे एक शेर कहा था कि क्या फर्ज है कि सबको मिले एक सा जवाब, आओ ना हम भी सैर करें कोहे तूर की।
वाह वाह
तो
वाह।
उस स्पिरिट में मेरी ये कोशिश रहती है कि ठीक है, ये एक बुनियादी मसला है इस साइंस के इस क्षेत्र में, इस पे बड़े बड़े दिग्गजों ने मगज पच्ची करी, अपना दिमाग लगाया, और कुछ हद तक उन्होंने इसका कुछ जवाब भी निकाला। लेकिन क्यों ना हम इसको नए सिरे से अपने नज़रिए से देखें, हो सकता है हम कुछ और इसमें देख पाएँ, हम कुछ अलग इसमें दे पाएँ इसको समझने के लिए। तो ये मेरा फ़लसफ़ा रिसर्च का ये रहता है कि बुनियादी सवालात पे नए सिरे से, एक नए नज़रिए से देखा जाए, तो शायद कुछ नई समझ उसमें से पैदा हो।
Oh, brilliant, brilliant. This is amazing, amazing. You know, that fact and aspect of Ruchi and Abhiruchi, that is one of the most important aspect. So, Amitabh, I also kind of came to know that you had some very interesting experience during your PhD. May I request you to just elaborate that aspect a little bit more?
Yes, and this actually has to do with many of the aspects we were discussing earlier when you were talking about what motivated my philosophy of research and my philosophy of mentoring and so on.
Yeah, yeah,
So I talked about influences based on my mentors, that things that I sort of imbibed from them. There are also influences based on my own experiences as a PhD student.
nice.
So for the first 2 or 3 years of my PhD, or 2.5 to 3 years of my PhD, I would say I was still mentally a student. I hadn't quite made the transition in my head, in my development, of being a student or a consumer of knowledge
Hmm,
rather
hmm.
than a researcher or a producer of knowledge. I still had not made that transition. And this transition began to happen sometime around when I was in my third year of PhD. And it happened with two projects I got into that had nothing to do with my PhD thesis research at all. Uh,
Interesting.
so
Mhm.
I had proposed a certain PhD project which was approved by my committee, and I had set up experiments and I was collecting data every generation from those experiments. That work was going on the side. And
Okay.
I was still taking various courses that I found interesting. I continued taking courses till my last semester of PhD when
Wow.
I was writing my thesis, my last semester as a PhD student, I took one course because it was a new course offered for the first time, and I thought, okay, this is an opportunity to get this over.
Amazing.
So I ended up doing something like twice the number of courses that were actually required.
Wow.
Uh,
Okay.
but so one of these projects grew out of something that my advisor John Thompson used to work on, which was plant insect coevolution, and
Hmm.
this broad question of why many herbivorous insects are specialists rather than generalists. They eat only one species of plant instead of, um, why isn't everything like a lawnmower, every herbivorous insect? And I got interested in this simply because he and one of the grad students in the lab used to work on this, so I used to hear them. And then one day I asked him, has anybody done any genetic modeling of this? And he directed me to some papers. I read them. I didn't find them very convincing.
Hmm.
Uh, I frankly thought they were rather naively doing the modeling.
Okay.
And although these were very established researchers in the field. But then, as I said, I mean, skepticism is also important in science. And so I
Yes.
started working on this on the side on my own. And I said, let me try to do a more realistic multi gene model of this instead of assuming that these complex behaviors are controlled by a single gene, which to me didn't make any sense.
Nice.
And I
Nice.
eventually worked on this. I had a lot of fun. This was the time when I taught myself programming because I wanted to run a few simulations of some of my really cumbersome models. And so I also, it became a vehicle for me to try to do programming and run some simulations all on my own. I said, this had nothing to do with, nobody asked me to do this. This is not even
Nice.
part of my thesis work.
Wonderful.
And finally, the upshot of all of this, I had a lot of fun for about a year, figured out something, and then for a while I couldn't believe that nobody had ever pointed this out because a lot of big people in the field were working on this question, including my advisor.
Okay.
And then I spent a lot of time, another few months in the library, and again, this is pre-internet era, so you had to physically search the bound volumes
Okay.
because I couldn't believe that nobody had figured this out. And then it began to look like maybe nobody had. And then I went to John with this, and we talked about it, and it took me about a month to convince him that this made sense.
Hmm.
Because see, and this is one point I want to stress again, especially in the Indian context.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the upshots of this work was that if what I was saying was actually right, then the way my advisor and all the other guys had been studying this question was basically wrong. So, and this is
Yeah.
my first paper with John Thompson.
Okay,
So,
okay.
as a grad student, my first paper with my advisor was saying, among other things, that the way you have been doing this for the last 10 years is basically flawed and it will not work.
Okay.
I can't easily imagine this working out in a typical Indian biology
Indian.
lab.
Yes,
You
yes.
will get something like, you think you know more than me.
Mm, mm, mm,
What do you think of yourself? I mean, just shut up and do the experiment I want you to do. Who asked you
mm.
to do all this stuff? So this was one thing, and the thing is that because this was a problem I identified, I got interested in, I understood, I did the literature reading, I worked on it on my own. I actually roamed around in a mental trance on this for a few months and
Wow.
finally solved it. And this was my first experience of making a transition from being a student to being a researcher,
Researcher.
and it was intoxicating, literally.
Nice, nice.
uh, Similar thing around the same time happened. I There was a new faculty who joined the department and offered a new advanced course called plant microbe interactions. Again,
Mm.
had nothing to do with my thesis research.
Okay.
I thought, hey, it's a totally different and new kind of course. Let me register for this course. I learn something new and different. So I
Yeah.
registered for his course, and then eventually we had to write a term paper for that course. Now, one of the topics that came up in his course very indirectly was this so called cost of sex problem, which is
Hmm.
the notion that all else being equal, an individual that reproduces sexually is less efficient and therefore has lesser Darwinian fitness than one which can reproduce asexually by
Asexual.
just
Okay.
making clones of itself.
Interesting.
So then the issue is there is this cost of sex in evolutionary terms. What is the benefit that overrides the cost in so
Hmm.
many cases? And one of the ideas was that microbial infection pressure is what makes it beneficial to produce genetically diverse, sexually produced offspring. And this is what offsets the cost. So that is why this issue appeared in his course. I got interested in this cost of sex stuff. So halfway through the semester, I went to him and I asked him that, would you mind if I do the term paper on the cost of sex problem itself rather than the plant microbe angle to it?
Mm, mm.
He said, fine, do that. Then I got into it a little bit more deeply. I started reading about, what people have suggested, what is the root cause of this cost of sex. And I realized that there was a debate raging in the literature which involved very substantial people in the field like John Maynard Smith and G.C. Williams, towering figures in evolutionary biology.
Evolution. Yeah. Mm.
And there was this unresolved argument. Basically, again, to slightly caricature it into a nutshell, G.C. Williams was arguing that the cost of sex is essentially the cost of genome dilution because a sexual mother is related to her offspring only by 50%, whereas an asexual mother is related to her offspring by 100%. And
Nice,
that's
nice.
what the cost of sex really is. And Maynard Smith was saying that the cost of sex is actually the cost of investing in male reproductive function, which
Hmm.
otherwise those resources could be used to make more asexual eggs.
Nice,
And this
nice.
argument had been going on for 20 years. And again, I started going through their models and I didn't quite uh, find them very realistic. And then I thought, let's make it a little bit more realistic. And
Nice, nice.
once, so I basically added one or two uh, other parameters into their kind of model, which reflected some biological reality. And the minute you do that, you realize that this whole dispute about which one is the cost of sex is because implicitly one of them has fixed the value of this parameter at zero, the other
Okay.
one implicitly fixed it as one. The minute you treat it as a parameter which can vary between 0 and 1, you realize that except for these two boundaries, everywhere both of them have a contribution to the cost of sex. And you can quantify their relative contributions.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
And again, I spent quite a lot of time trying to figure out, how come nobody resolved this? I mean, come on, these are all great people. I mean, these are people whose textbooks we are learning from. How come
Okay.
they didn't figure this out? And it turns out they didn't. And so one of the messages again, and this till this day, this remains one of the most personally satisfying pieces of work I did. And the story gets even more interesting. So I figured out certain things in the process of doing this,
Mm-hmm.
which at that time I didn't realize had much broader implications.
Implications. Nice. Nice.
I thought of them only in the context of the cost of sex because that was the context in which those insights occurred to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, so this is work I was doing around 1990. Uh, Fast forward to about 218, 219, and this is some work that I and Sutirth and Prasad and my colleague Vidya do together on fundamental questions like, how do we conceptualize Darwinian fitness or natural selection and so on. And I suddenly realized that those insights that I had gotten then as a grad student
It's a student.
actually apply to the entire theory of natural selection. They are not unique
Nice.
to the cost of sex problem. They connect back to what, and in some ways, so having told these stories, why do I like to tell these stories? There are two or three very
Mm-hmm.
interesting things which I think are important for especially young grad students to hear. One
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
if something interests you seriously, to the
Mm-hmm.
extent that you are willing to spend a week without much sleep thinking about it, then it's probably worth doing something about it, even
Doing
if it has
something about it.
nothing to do with your thesis work. Nobody prevents you from doing other things on the side while you are doing your PhD.
True. True.
Uh, the second thing is, I mean, a lot of times you will have a bright idea which you will realize, and this will happen to me umpteen number of times. You have a bright idea, and then you wake up the next morning and either realize that there's a flaw in the idea. This
Yeah.
is what Sutirth and I used to call the 24-hour test.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you still think your idea is bright after 24 hours and one night of sleep, then maybe there's something to it.
Something.
So many ideas get killed right there.
Nice. Nice.
Alternatively, you have a bright idea and then you go a little bit deeper and you realize somebody has already figured this out before you, which is fine. It's still satisfying that, you arrived at it independently. So I think one should not stop, no, one should not get prevented from pursuing certain ideas thinking, oh, I'm just a PhD student. Somebody must have done this. Great people are working in the field. Very often, maybe great people didn't think of it the way you are thinking of it. It,
Exactly.
it
Yeah.
happens. It happens
That's
sometimes that way also. And everybody is thinking about a problem from a certain perspective,
perspective.
which may be partly guided by the context of how the field was in their time. And now the context has changed. You are
Change.
different. You might come up with something interesting. So it's worth being perhaps a little bit cocky and thinking that, hey, maybe I can solve this problem.
Nice. Nice.
Um, one of the problems we solved in our lab, actually, along with a very, very interesting BSMS summer student from ISER Pune at the time,
Ah.
uh,
Okay.
was a problem that for us popped up in the context of metapopulation dynamics, but is really an old problem in physics also,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
is that simulation studies typically show that if you have two coupled chaotic oscillators
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
you couple them at moderate coupling strength,
Okay.
they get stabilized in their dynamics to low period cycles and they simultaneously go 180 degrees out of phase. So
Wow.
this was observed in uh, simulations. This was observed in certain physical experiments.
Mm-hmm.
This was observed in a biological experiment in Sutir's science paper, basically. And we finally came up with a potential explanation for why this happens in the way it does. Why do they simultaneously get stabilized to low period cycling and also go out of phase? And this is a problem that physicists had also been working on for about 20 years. And
Nice, nice.
basically, we are the guys who solved it. So,
Absolutely.
in biology, we are often used to this idea that physicists will come into biology and solve problems that we couldn't solve. Well, once in a while, it goes the other way
It
also.
goes that.
It
No, no, no.
can go the other way.
It has happened few times too. Yeah, yeah.
So, that is one thing. The other thing, and this is something that has continued to hit me again and again in the
Mm-hmm.
course of my career, is various problems that I have worked on, which at the time and for many years subsequently I thought were sort of standalone problems,
Yeah, yeah.
end up being connected with other
Connected.
things I worked on. Or, I mean, I'm now beginning to realize more and more that five or six completely different kinds of things that I have worked on, broadly speaking, in my life actually are quite interconnected. It's just that when I was
Interconnected.
younger, I didn't see it.
Nice.
And that's
Beautiful.
somehow very satisfying. When
Absolutely.
you see that it
Absolutely.
all fits in. So I think it's also important, see, because the thing is, whether we like it or not, uh, creative thinking is a young person's game.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you
This
think so?
becomes, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
This
Okay.
becomes completely clear if you look at mathematics, because that's where the experiment is the cleanest. In
Mm.
mathematics, you don't need infrastructure,
Mm.
facilities, fancy equipment, right? Almost, with a couple of exceptions, almost all great mathematical research has been done by people below the age of 35.
Mm. Mm.
There are
Mm.
hardly a couple of exceptions to this. Now, in experimental sciences like biology, where you need a lot of facilities and so on, often what happens is when you are younger, you may not have the facilities.
Yes, yeah.
You might be 50 years old before you have all the equipment in your
Mm.
lab, and therefore you make some big discovery when you're 55. But in terms of creative thinking, uh, with age, the ability goes down. I mean, there's a little bit of benefit in that experience helps.
Mm. Mm.
Your thinking can be a little bit richer because of the experience. I'm not downplaying that totally. But at a fundamental level, you can feel that your brain just does not work the same way when you're 45 as it did when you were 25.
Very interesting. Very
Uh,
interesting.
you don't have that degree of intellectual stamina anymore.
Mm.
So
Mm.
basically, the difference is, when I was a PhD student, I could focus on a problem like a laser beam.
Mm.
The
Mm.
rest of the world would cease to exist for a week, for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks. Now I can manage it for a day.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
That kind of focus,
Mm. Mm.
if at all. So the problem here is with our system, and this is why I feel so deeply about this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We expect and evaluate young faculty who have joined to rapidly start publishing stuff.
Mm. Mm. Yes. Yes.
Now, that guarantees that young faculty will not work on any fundamental question. Because fundamental questions, there is no guarantee that you will have some decent number of publications after 3 years or 4 years.
True. True.
So, we are incentivizing the guys who are at the peak of their creative mental abilities to waste their time working on trivial problems that will be resulting in quick publications because they
Publication.
happen to be trivial but fashionable at that point in time.
Mm. Mm.
And we expect the guys who are like me, the wrong side of 50, to work on the deep blue sky problems when, our minds are not really up to it anymore that much as they were when we were 25 years
Thank you.
old. And I think
Nice.
this is a tragedy of epic proportions, because the young faculty, the PhD students, these are the guys who have the best likelihood
Like,
of doing seriously creative stuff on fundamental questions.
very
And
nice.
these are the
Very nice.
guys who we are discouraging and disincentivizing. See, PhD students, we tell them, no, no, you don't do your own thinking. I will do the thinking for you. You do
Mm,
this experiment because anyway you have to finish your PhD in 5 years and whatever, you know. And, and don't work on this. This is too fundamental. And what if it doesn't work out? Then you won't have a thesis to show for it. So we are basically totally disincentivizing the young people from doing fundamental research. Instead, we want them to go after low hanging fruit, which will
mm,
lead
mm.
good publications. And
Yeah.
as I wrote somewhere else in this context, in an article I wrote for PINSA
Mm,
quite a few years ago, I said that if you incentivize for a singer for them to deliver several hit songs early in their career,
yeah.
you will end up selecting for Bhappi Lahiri, not Bhimsen Joshi.
Nice, nice. No offense to Bapilari, but
No offense to Bhappi Lahiri, but
yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. So now this is a very crucial element of the stage of the researcher. What you're mentioning, it has a deep ramification on what problems they can solve, and also the stage of their lives play a critical role. I can see the point, because there is also some kind of thought process where experience does play a role, where you can
yes,
actually bring in
yes,
some interesting stuff, and you
yes,
would be able to do
absolutely.
something. Yeah, yeah.
And my point is that, see, if you're talking about a young researcher or a PhD student,
Mm, mm.
uh, of course, somebody else's experience is never a substitute for your own experience entirely, but
Absolutely.
they can benefit from your experience as a mentor, and they can bring their extremely youthful, not already stuck in a
In,
preconceived rut kind of creative thinking to a problem. I think that is what should be leveraged during a PhD,
nice.
and people should. I mean, one other very interesting thing that my PhD advisor John Thompson once said, which I remember and I keep telling this to students now,
Hmm.
is he said that, see, when you're doing a PhD on a certain topic, at least during the second half of your PhD,
Mm.
what that implies is that you should be the world's greatest authority on that topic, not
Topic.
me, not your advisor, you.
You
And if
exactly.
that is not true, then there's something wrong with your PhD.
Yeah, yeah. Very nice. Very nice. That's actually very well put, because I s- see the value of looking at PhD this way, because it has been brought to question of the value of the research itself nowadays, and this is a very kind of valuable lesson when one looks at why one should think deeply about a problem, become independent, and also kind of take their own paths, as you are mentioning. Very fascinating. So we are almost about to conclude the podcast, where I also request my guests to kind of give a big picture. Amitabh, what is the big picture about the life you have lived, the kind of stuff what you have thought about? It has inspired a lot of people, including me, and various different students and your fellow colleagues. What is the way you would want to actually look at what you have done until now, and what is the interest you are now kind of cultivating, and how do you go about from there?
Huh, that's an interesting and
Mhm.
slightly weird, to me, slightly weird question.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, See, it's very strange. As I said, in many ways, I never planned my life in any
yeah,
particular
yeah.
way. I've sort of gone along with the way things happen. What I have tried to do in my own way to some degree is live up to something that my mother always used to tell us. And she used to say that, if you do anything, do it properly, give
Mm.
it your 100%.
Yeah, yeah.
And she used to say this in Hindi. It was like, अगर कोई काम करो तो ठीक से करो या
Mm.
फिर मत करो.
Mat karo. Okay.
Don't do it if you are not going to do it with 100% sincerity. Don't even bother to do it. There's no
Mm.
point doing half-hearted stuff. So I don't do half-hearted stuff. Whether it is my professional work as a scientist, whether it is teaching, whether it is mentoring, whether it is my poetry, whether it is my
Mm.
interest in anything else in music or history or philosophy or whatever, nothing about when I spend time with it, it's never half-hearted.
Nice.
Uh,
Nice.
Beyond that, I must confess that I my philosophical outlook on life is a slightly weird mixture of
Hmm.
being extremely self-centered while also being simultaneously, and anybody who has studied Iqbal will not feel that this is a contradiction, self-abnegatory in a certain way. What
Nice.
I
Nice.
mean by self-centered is I don't think there is a grand purpose to life.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think if there is one thing that biology teaches you is that there is no grand purpose to life.
Purpose.
And long ago I had written a couplet on this in Urdu
Uh-huh.
saying, मैं कौन हूँ सदियों से आदम पूछता फिरता रहा. So Adam, man,
Wow.
has been
Wow.
asking for centuries, मैं कौन हूँ? Who am I?
Mm. Mm.
मैं कौन हूँ सदियों से आदम पूछता फिरता रहा. जुज यही मैं हूँ जवाबे रूह आदम कुछ नहीं. But
Wow.
other
Wow.
than I am, the soul of Adam gives no other reply. I
Yes. Nice.
am. I am not for this or because of
As of
this
that.
or in order to achieve this. I am not part of anybody's grand plan. I certainly don't have any grand plan. I'm not trying to do anything particularly profound in my life. All I have been trying to do is, as I said, do whatever I do with 100% sincerity. And I have always been really fascinated by learning new things.
Mm.
I still
Mm.
enjoy learning new things. So, in some ways, I feel, I mean, my body objects to this from time to time, but I still feel like I'm a little kid and I'm still curious about everything. But
Be
then
like
every now
that.
and
Be like
then,
that.
your shoulders and your knees say, "Boss, you are not a kid. Yeah, come on, wake up." But um, so I think, see, so I don't think there is a grand thing that one is trying to. At least I am not trying to achieve in life. Now, having said that, so what is it that you feel happy about having done?
Yeah.
Other
Yeah.
than the fact that you figured out many things and you were greatly satisfied because you were able to figure out many things, that's a very personal satisfaction. That
True.
ये समझ में आ गया, वो समझ में आ गया, that kind of thing. Other than that, what are the things that make you happy? One of the things I think is very important in academics is the teaching and the mentoring that we do is
True.
far, far, far more important than the research we do. Far more important. The research is relatively trivial compared to
Mm.
the mentoring and the teaching. So the most important thing I think we do is, and again, I'm not saying that we should take credit for what our mentees did in
Mm.
any sense. That is not what I'm saying at all. Because the guys who come and who do great work, they are guys who were really good when they came to you, right?
Nice.
The
Nice.
credit, if at all, goes to their parents and maybe their primary school teachers
Like,
for shaping them in that way.
absolutely.
By
Absolutely.
the time they come to you for a PhD, they are already grown up
Sure. Yeah.
personalities.
Yeah.
Now, what is it that you can do? And to use a very evolutionary genetics metaphor, they have a great genotype.
Mm.
What the mentor can do is provide the optimal environment to get the best possible genotype by environment interaction so that they blossom into the best possible phenotype.
Amazing. Nice.
That's
Nice.
what we can do. And uh, if you can do that, one of the greatest pleasures in academic life is watching people who work with you for some time go on to do fantastic work and become fantastic mentors themselves
Themselves.
and pass
Yes.
it on to their students. That
Nice.
is I think the thing that makes one happy as an
Happy.
academician.
Absolutely. It's a very fulfilling thing. Yeah.
And that's about it. See, beyond that, I mean, uh, the world has its own dynamics.
Yeah.
I never had any illusions that we as individuals or I as a particular individual are going to change the world. That's not
Okay.
going to happen. What you can do is try to create a little world in your lab or your little, niche where your ideas do have some value, and try to shield people in that world from the world outside as much as possible so that they can find themselves and blossom. That's about it. I think
Wonderful.
that's the most
Wonderful.
important thing one can do in life, and that's pretty much it.
This is amazing. So, what we have now listened to is a glimpse of Amitabh Joshi. It's about science, it's about poetry, and it's about the cross links between science and poetry, both in form of words and in form of thoughts. What Amitabh has given to us. In fact, truly speaking, this has been one of the very refreshing conversations I've ever had. I am also sure that this is not going to be the last one where Amitabh will be appearing, and I hope Amitabh would reappear at some point of time to elaborate on some of the things what we have discussed a little bit more. So this is
Oh,
just
I would love
yeah.
to.
Yes, yes, yes. And in fact, we will also try to kind of do on specific themes what you have actually talked about. There's a lot to really go back and listen to and go a little deeper into the things what Amitabh has already mentioned. So Amitabh, it's been an absolute pleasure to converse with you. And I would also request you to make your final comments, and we'll conclude. Yeah.
Well, I don't have any final comments other than to say thank you for inviting me to join you for this most enjoyable conversation. I've had a lot of fun in this conversation as well. And as I said, I would love to be back again.
Yes.
There are many other things we could talk about too, which we have not
Absolutely.
talked about today, which
Absolutely,
are
absolutely. You know,
completely.
I
Um,
we haven't touched upon anything related to history, anything related to deeper aspects of
yeah,
philosophy,
yeah,
and
yeah,
various different aspects of music, which Amitabh is also deeply interested in.
yeah. Although I must confess, I have practically zero knowledge of music. Uh,
Same here, same here,
I,
same here.
I just like certain kinds of
Like,
music to
yeah,
listen
yeah,
to. I
exactly.
don't know. I never learned music at all.
Yes, yes,
But
yes.
yeah, no, it would be greatly fun. And I think the one last thing maybe I would say, just to
Yeah, yeah,
sum up many of the themes we talked about,
yeah,
given that mentoring is so important
yeah.
to academics, I think one thing that often people don't think about when they talk about mentoring, you sort of mentor your PhD students in how to solve certain kinds of problems, how to use certain methodologies to solve problems, and so on. I
True.
think it's equally important to mentor them into how do you set up a problem?
Problem.
How do you
Yes.
identify a problem? What makes a problem scientifically interesting as opposed to just interesting to you?
Interest.
Because
Nice. Nice.
everything, see, there is no shortage of interesting things in the world. That doesn't mean you are going to do research on all of them. So the problem
Absolutely.
also has to be scientifically interesting in addition to being personally of interest to you. So we need to also spend time while mentoring, although this slows things down a lot. It's
Mm.
much easier and
Easier.
faster to have a PhD student come and say, boss, work on this question, do it like this, show me the results. That's much
Yes.
faster. But
Yes. Yes.
it's much better for the mentee if you try to say, okay, fine, how do you set up the problem?
Mm. Mm.
How, now that you have identified the broad contours of the problem, how do you break it up into single experiment sub problems? Then
Yes.
how do you choose which one of those to do first?
First.
Because
Yes.
some of those, if you solve them one way, it might have implications for how you will do the other. So you need to decide which one you do first. These things also need to be conveyed while mentoring or guiding a PhD student. The other thing which needs to be conveyed is how the academic system works.
Mm, mm.
See, today's PhD student, 5 years down the line, is tomorrow's young faculty.
Yes, yes.
Now, at that point, how the academic system works, how committees work or don't work in many cases, all that I think also should be part of the mentoring process, so that by the time your mentee becomes a faculty, they also know about what to expect when setting up their lab and having to deal with funding agencies and all that. See, again, this is something, in my experience, many guides don't talk about this. They just
Yeah,
do it and they arrange the funding and they never talk about this to their students. I think it's
absolutely.
important to talk about this to the students too, so that, and I have already had this feedback from some of my earlier students who, having become well known enough in their own rights to now be on all kinds of committees,
Yeah.
uh, often they come back and say, it's really helpful all those times you used to tell us stories about what goes on in these committees, because now it's not an alien thing. We kind of know
Brilliant.
what to expect when we go there.
Nice, nice.
So I think all of this needs to be part of mentoring, and most importantly, mentoring also has to be about conveying to your students, your PhD students, how to be a good mentor.
Mm, mm.
They need
True,
to be
true.
mentored about mentoring as well. We never think
Yes.
about the second order mentoring. You see,
Entering.
all too often we think mentoring means give them a good problem and show them how to tackle the problem.
Yeah,
That's just
yeah.
one part of it.
One part of, yeah, true, true.
Yeah, I think that is
Fascinating,
important.
fascinating. Absolutely, absolutely. There is a lot of gems in this particular conversation. As I told, I would request the listeners to go back and check each and every aspect of what is been kind of discussed. There's a lot to further understand and also appreciate and go little deeper. I will also link a lot of things which we have already been discussed, some of which related to the science and some related to poetry. And you can also go deeper and explore many things. So thank you very much, Amitabh. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And this is Pratidwani, where we try to humanize science.
Thank you.